Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. This is David and Kimberly Cam. The two grew up in the same city, New Albany, Indiana, and crossed paths back in the mid-1980s. They hit it off, and by 1989, Kim had become David's second wife. Things seemed to be heading in the right direction. That same year, David applied to join the Indiana State Police, and before long, he was accepted, eventually working as a police officer in the emergency response unit. Fast forward a few years to 1993, and the couple welcomed their first child together, a boy named Bradley. It was Kim's first baby, but David's second, as he already had a daughter from his previous marriage. Life seemed to be good for the growing Cam family. But things began to unravel in the summer of 1994, when David started an affair with a younger woman named Stephanie McCarty, someone he met at the gym. This betrayal couldn't have come at a worse time for Kim. She was pregnant with their second child. The situation escalated quickly. David moved out of their home and into his mistress's, leaving Kim to lean on her family for support. Despite everything, both her family and David stayed by her side, offering the help she needed during such a challenging time. When Kim gave birth to their daughter, Jillian, on February 28, 1995, both sides of the family showed up for support. Everyone, that is, except David. By March of that year, however, the affair ended, and David sought reconciliation. Despite the heartbreak, Kim considered giving him another chance, driven by her love for her family and her role as a mother. Surprisingly, David moved back in, and Kim's decision to forgive him was met with support from both families. Soon after, they began building a new home on Lockhart Road in Georgetown, Indiana, a fresh start for the reunited couple. They chose to live in this location because of its personal connection. The road was actually named after some of David's relatives on his mother's side, adding a layer of history and significance to their home. For a while, things seemed to improve, and it looked like they were on the right track. But as the saying goes, once a cheater, always a cheater. David, known for being a flirt, didn't just stop at flirting. He would find women to have casual affairs with, often using his patrol car as his hookup spot. On top of that, David was involved in a lawsuit with two other state troopers, accused of assaulting a 19-year-old during an arrest. To add to his already shaky record, there were numerous other complaints filed against him. His ego took a hit when he got demoted yet again, which only fueled his narcissistic tendencies. Fed up with the lack of respect, David made a bold move. He handed in his resignation and joined his uncle's basement waterproofing business, landing a sales position. Suddenly, the perks were clear. His new job gave him better hours, meaning he was actually around more often for Kim and the kids, something he hadn't been able to do as a state trooper. Now, he wasn't just a stranger in his own home. He was there, involved. Plus, he was making way more money than he ever did as a cop, which added a touch of luxury to their lives. By the year 2000, everything seemed to be falling into place for the family. Bradley, now 7 years old, was doing great in second grade at Graceland Christian School, while his little sister Jill, just 5, was in kindergarten at the same school. Kim was thriving in her job as a senior accountant at Insurance Group in Louisville. From the outside, life seemed perfect now. But even in this seemingly happy home, there were still whispers about David's possible cheating. The rumors had been floating around, and Kim had even shared her worries with her best friend. But despite all the gossip, nothing ever came of it until one fateful evening in September. On Thursday, September 28, 2000, David followed his usual routine, playing basketball with friends at the local church rec center. Kim, as always, took care of the kids' activities and got them home. It was just another regular evening. However, the game ran later than David had expected. By the time he was done, he was in a hurry to get home, worried Kim might be upset. Their house was just a few minutes away, so he grabbed his garage door remote and pulled into the driveway. But as the garage door slowly opened, what David saw inside stopped him dead in his tracks. In the garage, his wife Kim was lying on the floor, with what appeared to be a gunshot wound to her head. A pool of blood spread across the floor beneath her. The passenger door of her black Ford Bronco was open, but David couldn't immediately tell if his kids were in the car. He rushed to the Bronco and looked inside. In the back seat, his worst fears came true. His children, Jill and Bradley, were in the same horrifying condition as Kim. David's law enforcement instincts took over. He quickly assessed the situation and realized Kim and Jill were beyond saving. David believed his son might still be alive since the boy showed no signs of head injuries. Acting on hope, he climbed into the passenger side of the Bronco, maneuvered through the 2 front bucket seats, and carefully lifted his son out. And when he touched Bradley, he felt a faint warmth in his small body. He placed the boy on the garage floor and began administering CPR. During this process, David's left knee pressed into the middle of the back seat, which caused Jill's head and body to slump forward and to the left. This motion brought her into contact with David's t-shirt, leaving traces of blood on it. Now, this moment became one of the most critical points in the case. Whether David was guilty or not, his actions now intertwined his DNA with the crime scene. And when his efforts failed, reality hit him like a truck. David knew he needed to act quickly. In a panic, he called the Indiana State Police Department, his former workplace, for help. After the call, he sprinted across the street to his uncle's house, shouting for someone to tell him what had happened. He then dashed back to the garage, consumed with confusion and fear. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Kim, exactly as David had described, her body lying on the floor with her pants removed, blood trailing from her head. Nearby, Bradley's lifeless body was found, while Jill's body was in the back seat of the car. It was immediately suspected that all 3 victims had been shot to death. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, in the garage, there was a bleach. The detectives also found some unidentified fingerprints on the outside of Kim's car, but they didn't think much of it since she parked in a public lot every day for work, which could explain the prints. On the floor of the garage, tucked under Bradley's body, was a sweatshirt with the word backbone written inside the collar that no one seemed to recognize. When the police asked David about it, he claimed it wasn't his. As mentioned, Kim wasn't wearing any pants when she was found, only her underwear and shirt. However, her pants were nearby, covered in blood. And as with any murder case, the spouse is always the first one to be questioned, and David wasn't exempt from this. David was completely cooperative, providing a clear timeline of his day, and explaining that Kim and the kids had probably come home around 7:30 or 7:40 p.m. Looking at the state of the car, David thought the murders must have happened almost immediately after they arrived home. Yet, he couldn't figure out who could have wanted to hurt his family. Kim and the kids weren't involved in anything that would have made them enemies, and when it came to his alibi, David stuck to his guns. He insisted that he was exactly where he said he'd be, at a basketball game at the rec center from 7 o'clock to 9:20 in the evening. David also kept insisting that Kim wouldn't have done anything to provoke this kind of violence. So, at first, the investigators wondered if it might have been a robbery gone wrong. But that idea didn't last long. There was no sign of forced entry into the garage, nothing seemed to be missing from the house, and no one had tried to get inside. The evidence was pointing away from theft and towards something much darker. A targeted attack on Kim, Bradley, and Jill. But the most damning evidence came later when the phone company revealed that David made a call at 7:19 p.m. on the night of the murders. The call was made from his home's landline, which was a huge red flag because David had claimed to be playing basketball from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. The fact that he made a call after 7 p.m. contradicted his story, and it raised serious doubts. The autopsy report added more to the mystery. All 3 victims had died from gunshot wounds, but the examiner also found that Jill had blunt force trauma to her genital area. This injury seemed to have occurred within the same 24-hour period as her death. The examiner suggested it might have been caused by a fall, but the possibility of an assault couldn't be ruled out. Strangely, Jill had complained of pain in that area during her dance class, even crying about it. Whether this had anything to do with the trauma to her body was uncertain, but it was a chilling detail. Kim had confided in a friend just before the murders, saying history is repeating itself. Kim didn't elaborate, but her friend suggested that she bring the kids down to Florida for a visit to talk more. Kim agreed that a trip might help, but tragically, she never got the chance. So was Kim referring to a history of abuse? Perhaps something related to David's alleged infidelity? Or possibly something darker? We may never know, as Kim was taken from her family before she could share the truth. The medical examiner's report also revealed something unsettling. Kim had cuts and bruises on the tops of her feet. Her shoes were oddly placed on top of the car, which just didn't make sense. The police had no clear explanation for any of this, and it was still early in the investigation. But people close to David, including Kim's mother, started to have serious doubts about him. Her mother believed that Jill, a sassy, outgoing child, would have spoken up if someone she wasn't familiar with had hurt her. The only person she thought might have been able to silence Jill was David. 3 days later, on Sunday, the rumors continued to swirl, especially since no arrest had been made yet. Despite the growing tension, David went to church with his parents and friends, just as he always did. His uncle, the pastor, led the service, and the church had strong connections to the family. Kim had served as the treasurer, and David's grandfather had even helped build the church. During the service, David cried the entire time, showing what seemed to be genuine emotion. But things took a dramatic turn as he left the church. A swarm of reporters surrounded him, and the media coverage quickly cast a shadow of suspicion over him. People couldn't help but notice that David didn't seem to be grieving in the way they expected. His cold, stoic demeanor raised more questions. Could David have been responsible for the brutal murders of his wife and children? And if so, why? Well, later that afternoon, David came into the station to speak with the police, and things got a bit heated. After this interview, the police arrested him, and it all came down to two things: his shirt and a phone call. The call, made at 7:19 in the evening, didn't match his alibi of being at the rec center from 7 o'clock to 9:20 o'clock. That contradiction was enough to land him in custody. But the aftermath wasn't just about David. It was about his whole family. In the close-knit town of Georgetown, where everybody knows everybody, the Cam family became public enemy number one. Strangers gave them ugly stares. Their answering machine filled up with hateful messages. And if that wasn't enough, the local community started calling them a pack of wolves. The fallout even reached David's grandfather, whose church shut its doors because so many members wanted nothing to do with the Cam name. By March of 2002, it was trial time, and the prosecution came in hot, determined to answer the burning question, why would David do this? Their theory: his affairs. They argued David was so done with his marriage to Kim that instead of just filing for divorce, he chose the unthinkable of murdering his entire family. To sell this idea, the prosecution brought in about a dozen women who either had affairs with David or claimed he'd made a move on them while he was married to Kim. Over weeks of testimony, they painted David as a serial cheater with no respect for his marriage vows. Then came the evidence. The prosecution hung their case on two key pieces: blood spatter and that suspicious phone call. But the defense wasn't about to roll over. They argued the blood on David's shirt didn't come from gunfire. Instead, they said it got there when Jill's blood-soaked hair brushed against him while he was trying to save his son, Bradley. To prove it, they put on a live demonstration in court using wigs and fake blood, showing how the same pattern could easily happen. As for the phone call, the defense blamed Indiana's notoriously confusing time zones. They explained that the call's timestamp didn't account for a 1-hour difference between zones. When adjusted, the call actually fit David's timeline. It was made before he even left for his basketball game. And then there was David's alibi: basketball. Every single one of the 11 guys on his team testified that he was at the church gym the entire time. He never left, not even for a minute. With this rock-solid lineup, it seemed like the defense had poked some serious holes in the prosecution's case. But the jury didn't see it that way. They convicted David on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy, and he was sentenced to 195 years in prison. At first, it seemed like everyone could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Justice had been served, right? Well, not so fast. David wasn't ready to go down quietly. He appealed, arguing that the evidence about his affairs should have never been allowed in court. And guess what? In 2004, the judge agreed, overturning his conviction. Just like that, the case was thrown back into chaos. David's second trial was scheduled for January 2006, but something game-changing happened in early 2005. The defense pushed for another look at the DNA from the sweatshirt found at the crime scene. Specifically, they wanted the unknown DNA profiles, 2 of them, run through CODIS, the national DNA database. The prosecution had previously refused, but after a court order, they were forced to comply. The test results came back with a match for one of the DNA samples, and it turned out this particular sample had never been tested before, even though the prosecutor had assured everyone it had been analyzed and found no matches. The DNA was linked to Charles Boney, a convicted felon from nearby New Albany. Boney had been out on parole at the time of the crime after being convicted for a series of armed attacks on women, many of which involved stealing their shoes. One of his most recent crimes was an armed robbery and attempted abduction of 3 women at gunpoint. Now, Boney had a disturbing history. Some of his victims reported receiving harassing phone calls for months before the attacks, where he asked what they were wearing and if they wore high-heeled shoes. Boney had also admitted to having a foot fetish, a detail that seemed important to the defense, considering that Kim Cam's shoes had been removed and neatly placed on top of her car in a crime scene that was otherwise chaotic. Kim's feet also showed signs of bruises and abrasions, which seemed suspiciously linked to Boney's past behaviors. Boney was interviewed and took a polygraph test, but the results indicated that he was being deceptive. He denied involvement, claiming he had donated the sweatshirt to charity. However, just 2 weeks later, a palm print from Boney was found on Kim's vehicle, leading to his arrest. But what the police charged him with was conspiring with David to commit the murders. See, Charles ended up giving a 5-page written confession about how he knew David. He said that David seemed like a really sincere guy to him, and apparently, they met at a pickup basketball game in New Albany. He also claimed their paths crossed again later at a meat shop, where David asked Charles to buy him an untraceable gun for $250. Charles agreed and delivered the gun, inadvertently leaving his palm print on David's Bronco. However, Charles's story began to change during further questioning. He now claimed that David was a bad guy, accusing him of abusing his daughter, Jill, in an intimate way and cheating on his wife, Kim. According to Charles, David snapped when Kim discovered everything he was doing to their daughter, and that's when David wanted the whole family dead to cover his secrets. Charles said that before handing over the gun, he wrapped it in a gray sweatshirt to prevent oil leaks. He followed David to his house and waited in the driveway. Charles could hear a heated argument and then a gunshot. In a chilling moment, he described hearing Kim's son Bradley calling out, "Daddy, Daddy," before a gunshot rang out. Moments later, Charles claimed David came outside, aiming the gun at him as if to kill him too. Charles ran for cover in the garage, where he moved Kim's shoes as if tidying up while fleeing for his life. After hearing a woman pull into the driveway, Charles fled the scene. In his confession, Charles claimed he only sold the gun to David and did not pull the trigger. He was reluctant to report the murders, fearing the authorities would pin the blame on him, especially as a black man. His statement eventually led to his arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, and he was sent back to jail, awaiting trial. After his arrest, it was revealed that Charles had previously spoken to Stan Faith, one of the prosecutors in David's first trial. Charles admitted to knowing Stan well and had consulted with him before being considered a suspect. Stan later expressed regret over his involvement. Another clue emerged when police discovered DNA from Charles's ex-girlfriend, Mala, on the gray sweatshirt. At the time, they were dating, but their relationship ended shortly after the murders. Mala described how Charles had told her he was going to work that evening, but later came home around midnight with scraped knees. He then showed her a gun, something she had never seen before, and she was uncomfortable with it. The next morning, Charles was watching news coverage of the murders with his mother. After a fight, Mala left and did not see Charles for weeks. She later broke up with him, but her blood on the sweatshirt was explained by her being diabetic and frequently pricking her finger for blood sugar tests. Charles's story began to unravel further. Despite claiming he fled the scene without retrieving the gun, his girlfriend's statement contradicted him, suggesting that Charles might have returned for the weapon. This fueled doubts about David's guilt. Still, both men were charged with the murders. While in jail, Charles wrote an autobiography, Blackbone, where he openly discussed selling the gun to David and his role in the murders. He also mentioned that David had promised him Kim's life insurance money in exchange for the gun. Charles's writings, along with his confessions and testimony from Mala, helped secure his conviction for conspiracy to commit murder. In 2005, Charles was sentenced to 225 years in prison as a habitual offender. And if you're asking, what about David? Well, his second trial kicked off on January 17, 2006, and things were about to get even more complicated. Remember, the reason he was granted a retrial in the first place was because the judge ruled that the prosecution had made a mistake by discussing David's many affairs. So when this second trial began, the courtroom was officially barred from talking about his infidelity, which had initially been one of the prosecution's key arguments. Without that piece of the puzzle, the prosecutors needed a new angle, and they didn't hold back. They pivoted to a shocking accusation. David had been G abusing his daughter, Jill, for a long period of time, and to cover up his actions, he murdered his entire family. The allegations were deeply disturbing and immediately made the case even more complex. But David's defense team didn't back down. They brought in a highly regarded medical examiner who stated that during Jill's autopsy, there was no evidence of sexual trauma, specifically no damage to her hymen. Of course, this didn't rule out the possibility of other forms of abuse, as some methods wouldn't leave visible damage. But the defense team argued that there wasn't enough proof to suggest sexual assault, and they claimed that the prosecution was exaggerating the evidence to create a narrative that suited their theory of the crime. This expert also pointed out that while Jill did have blunt force injuries, some of which were in her pelvic region, those injuries weren't necessarily indicative of sexual abuse. According to the expert, these were simply injuries sustained during the brutal attack, and there was no concrete evidence to support the prosecution's claims. Now, this trial wasn't just about the allegations against David. It was also about the new evidence that had emerged. Thanks to some investigative work that had tracked down Charles, the police uncovered a wealth of new details, much of which came from Charles himself. They even learned from Charles's own testimony that David had purchased a gun with the intent to murder his family. The defense continued to argue, however, that the prosecution's case wasn't strong enough to convict David beyond a reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony, on March 1, 2006, the jury convicted David for the murders of his wife Kim and their children, Jill and Brad. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But as soon as he was convicted, David appealed once again, and this time it was due to the abuse allegations involving his daughter. He maintained that there was no evidence to suggest he'd ever harmed Jill, and he argued that the accusations had influenced the jury's decision. And guess what? The Indiana Supreme Court sided with him. In a stunning move, they overturned the conviction, agreeing with David's claim that the prosecution's abuse allegations lacked proper evidence. The court stated that there was no competent evidence to support the sexual abuse accusations. Can you imagine what Kim's family was going through during all this? They had to relive their daughter and grandchildren's horrific deaths, only for it to happen over and over again in the courtroom. Kim's father, Frank, was absolutely devastated by the decision. I was kind of surprised by the overturn of the last verdict. All we want is the truth, and the truth is that David's guilty, he said, his voice full of frustration. Kim's family was determined to see David behind bars for life. They were sick of the back and forth and just wanted justice. Fast forward nearly 13 years later, and David's third trial began in August of 2013. This trial was unlike the previous ones. The prosecution decided to go in a new direction, focusing on the life insurance policy that David had taken out on Kim before her death. According to Charles, David wanted the money, and he wasn't planning to let anyone get in his way. Interestingly, Kim's life insurance policy had been increased shortly before her death, but she had signed off on the changes, meaning she knew about and approved them. Charles took the stand again during this trial, and his testimony was as bombshell as ever. He claimed that David had tricked him into being at the house when the murders happened. Charles also testified that David nearly shot him before he managed to escape. According to Charles, David was the one who did all the killing, and Charles never touched Kim, Jill, or Brad. But David's defense team was ready. They had even more DNA evidence this time around. They presented proof that Charles's DNA was found on Kim's underwear, as well as on Jill's and Kim's clothing. What's more, Charles's DNA was found under Kim's nails, indicating that she had fought back before she was killed. Despite all the DNA evidence and Charles's questionable involvement, the most solid evidence linking David to the crime scene was the blood spatter on his shirt. The prosecution argued that the blood belonged to the victims, but David's defense team insisted that this could easily be explained by the fact that David had tried to help Brad after he was shot in the head, brushing up against his hair and leaving blood on his shirt. After weeks of deliberation and intense courtroom drama, the jury returned their verdict on October 24, 2013, not guilty on all charges. David was acquitted, and when the news was announced, he was overwhelmed with emotion. He broke down in tears, thanking his legal team and the jury for believing in him. It was a monumental moment after years of intense legal battles. However, not everyone was thrilled with the verdict. The community was divided. After all, 13 years of media coverage had left many wondering if David had truly been innocent. The evidence was strong, but some still felt there were unanswered questions. Despite the controversy, David decided to stay in the same town where it all happened. He got back to work at his uncle's business and started rebuilding his life. As if his trials hadn't been exhausting enough, David filed a civil lawsuit against several members of the prosecution team. You can't wreck someone's life, take away their freedom, their reputation, their identity, and you're not supposed to do that in this country, he said, making his anger clear. In the end, he received a settlement of over $5 million, part of which he used to repay those who supported him throughout his 13-year battle. Today, David is trying to move on. He's rebuilt his life from the ground up, but the pain of losing his family and reputation is still there. Since the acquittal, he's remained in contact with the jury members who helped secure his freedom. He was even hired by the Innocence Project as a case coordinator. The nonprofit works to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals, and David seems to be a perfect fit for the organization, given his own wrongful conviction experience. Meanwhile, Charles, the man at the center of all the controversy, still maintains his innocence. He's claimed to have found Jesus, and is now a devout Christian. In recent interviews, he's given several versions of what happened that night, but his story hasn't wavered. He says that on the night of the murder, he took an untraceable weapon to the Cam residence. He claims he heard arguing, followed by shots, and that David was the one who pulled the trigger. It's tough to wrap your head around why Charles did what he did, especially with all the conflicting accounts. Many still believe that David had a role in the murders, but the evidence simply didn't add up to convict him. Some question whether Charles was motivated by greed, jealousy, or something deeper. Case 2. In the 1970s, Katie would have a life-changing moment at a softball game of all places, where she met Gary Eastburn, a young man who caught her eye and stole her heart. They connected instantly, and their relationship began to blossom. It was love at first sight. By 1975, they were married shortly after Gary enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, which would shape their future. The couple's family grew quickly. In 1979, they welcomed their first daughter, Kara, followed by Aaron in 1981, and then in 1983, Jana completed the family. By the time their third daughter arrived, Gary had achieved the rank of captain in the Air Force, and his military career really took off from there. He was stationed at Pope Air Force Base in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the Eastburn family settled into a very secure life, with Gary being a military man. Things were moving along smoothly for the Eastburns as they prepared for the next big chapter of their lives. In 1985, Gary received an assignment to be stationed in England, which would be the biggest step forward in his career. But it meant that Katie would be left behind to pack up their life and make do for the time being. As Gary began a 10-week officer training course at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, Katie stayed in Fayetteville with the children, handling the family as a mother of 3 beautiful daughters. There was a lot to get ready for, securing the house, the paperwork, and finding a way to find a new home for their dog, Dixie, because pets weren't allowed to travel to England. Katie put out an ad to find Dixie a new family, which would change the Eastburns' lives forever. What Katie didn't know was that the stranger responding to her ad would play a big role in the horrifying events that were about to unfold. In 1985, as Gary prepared to leave for his officer training at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, the family faced the reality of their upcoming relocation to England. The logistical details required attention, so there was more to it than just packing their things. They had to go through a ton of paperwork. Gary would be away for weeks, and Katie supported her husband's career and was left to manage the heavy burden of organizing everything for the move. The plan was for the family to reunite in England, but for now, it was just Katie and the 3 young children in Fayetteville. The biggest issue on Katie's mind was dealing with Dixie, the family's dog. Pets weren't allowed on the flight to England, and so Katie had no choice but to find Dixie a new home. It was a difficult decision, but she had to make it. But finding a new home for their 5th family member would bring her face to face with a man who would later be at the center of a horrific crime. While Katie managed these responsibilities, Gary's absence in Alabama was, at this point, the norm in their busy lives. His career had always been a priority, and the family had adjusted to the demands of military life. Gary's promotion to captain had brought them to Fayetteville in the first place, and the upcoming assignment to England was a big step forward. Katie supported her husband's ambitions, but it was clear that their family life was about to change in ways neither of them could have anticipated. She met Timothy Hennis. Hennis was a sergeant in the Army, living in the same Fayetteville area. He had been married to his wife Angela for a few years and had a young daughter, Christina. Hennis, like many young men, was trying to make a name for himself, balancing family life with the demands of his army duties. His life was ordinary until he responded to Katie's ad about Dixie. What followed next would be a series of small, seemingly innocent encounters that would become tragic in the most unimaginable way. On May 7, 1985, Hennis responded to Katie's ad and came to the Eastburn home to meet Dixie. Katie invited him inside, showing him the dog. He and his wife, Angela, loved dogs, but their current pet, Snowball, a mixed breed, was struggling to adjust to their newborn daughter. Despite their best efforts, Snowball was jealous of the baby, so Hennis and Angela knew they needed a dog that could thrive in a home with a young child. They hoped to find a dog that Christina could grow with and enjoy. Dixie seemed to be the perfect fit. Before he left the Eastburn home, Hennis politely asked to use the restroom, and Katie obliged, and with that he left Katie's house, unaware that he was about to go on a very dark path. At that moment, Katie couldn't have known that this encounter with Hennis would be one of the last peaceful days of her life. There was nothing to suggest that this harmless interaction would lead to tragedy. Katie had no reason to suspect anything other than that Hennis would simply be another man who was now the proud owner of a new dog. As Hennis left Katie's home with Dixie, the Eastburn family's life continued as planned. Gary was away at his officer training in Alabama, and Katie was busy with preparations for their move. The events that would follow were set in motion by this simple interaction. The evening of May 9, 1985, began like any other in the Eastburn home. Katie had spent the day taking care of her 3 young daughters, Cara, Erin, and Jana. But as night fell, the family's lives were changed. By the early morning hours of May 10th, Katie, Erin, and Cara were found brutally murdered. Katie was assaulted and sustained multiple stab wounds. Erin and Cara had their lives cut short and also suffered fatal injuries. Despite the brutality of the crime, the scene seemed undisturbed at first. The front door was locked, but neighbors noticed a pile of newspapers outside the house, indicating that no one had collected them for several days. By the evening of May 10th, Gary started getting concerned because his wife wasn't calling him like she usually would. So he contacted the Fayetteville Police Department. Officers responded the next day, but found no immediate signs of foul play. They left a note for Katie, hoping for a simple explanation. But the family had already been murdered. No one knew what exactly had happened, but on Sunday, May 12th, their neighbor, Army Sergeant Bob Seafelt, returned home to find his wife concerned after bailing out a soldier who had overindulged the previous night. She had noticed newspapers piling up on the Eastburn's doorstep. Their car was still in the driveway, and the baby's stroller was at the back door. This was when police discovered Katie, Erin, and Cara lying lifeless, victims of a brutal and senseless attack. Little Jana was alone in her crib, covered in filth and severely dehydrated, but she was the only one who survived. Katie, Erin, and Cara were found brutally murdered. Their throats were slit. Jana was just 22 months old at the time, trapped for 3 agonizing days. So Bob decided to pay a visit and heard what he believed to be an infant crying, but nobody was responding at the front door as he knocked and rang the doorbell. He called the Eastburn's babysitter, Julie Cherniak, who arrived shortly after. She looked through the window and noticed it was baby Jana crying alone in her crib. While her instinct was to immediately enter the house one way or the other, Bob asked her to wait for the police. Officer William Toman was the first to arrive. He retrieved Jana and a stack of diapers after forcing open a window and handed her over to Bob so he could investigate the scene. As he went through the house, the officer discovered the lifeless bodies of Katie and her 3-year-old daughter, Erin, and immediately called for backup. A deeper search of the house led to the discovery of 5-year-old Cara, lifeless on her bed. At this point, everybody had the same question on their mind. Why would anyone kill a beautiful young mother and her 2 daughters? Considering that this was a military family, the discovery of the crime had to lead to an intense investigation. On the night of the discovery, the task of piecing together the events was left to detectives Robert Biddle and Jack Watts of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office. They scoured the Eastburn home for any sign of the killer. Among the clues found were fingerprints and hair samples. A luminol test revealed evidence of a botched cleanup attempt. Someone had tried to scrub the walls and bathroom, but the stains couldn't be hidden. As Gary helped the investigators, he noticed missing items, including Katie's ATM card, $300 in cash, and a piece of paper with her ATM password written on it. It was a janitor named Patrick Cohn who would provide the first breakthrough in the investigation. Cohn approached Robert and Jack, claiming he'd seen a tall white man in jeans and a black members-only jacket leaving the Eastburns driveway in the early morning hours of May 10th. The man was carrying a garbage bag, and Patrick remembered the car being a white Chevrolet Chevette. His account narrowed the timeline, giving investigators a window for the murders. They took place between 8 p.m. on May 9th and 3 a.m. on May 10th. While investigators were searching the house for clues to identify the killer, a young man named Patrick Cohn came forward with information that would prove to be important for the case. He reported that he had seen a man leaving the house in the early hours of May 10th, the night of the murders. Patrick was walking home from his girlfriend's house around 3:30 a.m. the night of the murder when he saw the white Chevette parked on the road. A man was walking down the driveway of the Eastburn home, and as he passed him, all he said was, "I'm getting an early start this morning." He then watched him get in his car and drive off. Patrick gave the authorities a detailed description of the man. He was approximately 6 feet 4 inches, with blonde hair peeking out from under a black knit hat. With this new piece of information that would later prove to be vital to solving the triple homicide, police issued a public appeal via television and radio. They requested the man who had answered the Eastburns classified ad about the dog to contact them. This plea was accompanied by a composite sketch created from Patrick's description of the man he had seen leaving the Eastburn residence. Despite these leads, the investigation stalled as investigators scrambled for more information. But the case started to make sense when investigators realized Hennis had been involved with the Eastburn family shortly before the murders. So he became a potential suspect. The case drew a lot of media attention, and by May 15th, Hennis walked into the Fayetteville police station and submitted to interrogation with Biddle and Watts. His account was straightforward. He had picked up the Eastburn family dog on May 7th, but had no further contact with Katie, claiming he spoke to her on the phone just once on May 9th to check on Dixie. According to Hennis, after that call, he drove his wife and daughter to his in-laws' house and returned home after refueling his car. But this alibi would soon begin to unravel. Hennis and Angela returned home, believing they had fully cooperated with the investigation. Investigators collected more than just Hennis' testimony. They took blood, saliva, hair, finger and palm prints from him, and a photo lineup led to an identifying moment when Cohn picked out Hennis as the man he'd seen near the Eastburns' home. Things got even more complicated when it was discovered that Katie's stolen ATM card had been used on the night of May 10th and the morning of May 11th. The total amount withdrawn was $300, which was the exact amount that was stolen from Katie's wallet. Investigators, who were aware of Hennis' history with bad checks and late rent payments, also learned that a female witness had seen a blonde man matching Hennis' description near the ATM shortly after the second transaction, and Hennis' landlord received $300 in overdue rent shortly after the murders, furthering the suspicion that Hennis had financial motives for the crime. By May 1985, Hennis had become the prime suspect, and authorities began to watch his every move. But no physical evidence had yet linked him to the murders. It was all just circumstantial evidence. No one involved, not the police, Gary, or the neighbors, could have expected that this case would occupy courtrooms for the next quarter of a century. There were plenty more inconsistencies with his story. Hennis' alibi about dropping his family off at his in-laws' place was contradicted when his former girlfriend, Nancy Mazer, came forward, claiming he had visited her unexpectedly that same night. Then there was the black members-only jacket Hennis had brought to the dry cleaner on May 10th, which was further proof of his link to the crime, and neighbors recalled seeing him burning items in a barrel the morning after the murders. Each new piece of evidence made it harder to ignore the case against him. Later that evening, the police arrived at Hennis' doorstep with an arrest warrant. Hennis immediately called on the services of Beaver, Holt, Richardson, Sternlicht, Burge, and Glazier, one of the most famous law firms in Fayetteville. Jerry Beaver and Billy Richardson, two of the firm's best lawyers, were brought in who were known as the best in the business when it came to criminal defense throughout the state. And they wasted no time. They immediately hired private investigator Bob Nelliger to review the police investigation independently, examine the evidence, and search for any overlooked clues because the authorities were closing in. Hennis eventually got arrested with charges of physical assault and triple homicide. The evidence against him, however, was circumstantial, and prosecutors would need more than just suspicions to secure a conviction. The trial began in 1986, and it was clear that the case wouldn't be easy, especially not against the kind of lawyers Hennis had hired. The prosecution focused on circumstantial evidence, claiming Hennis killed the Eastburn family to cover up allegedly assaulting Katie. The timeline was clear, with the witness who had seen a tall, blond man leaving the house with a trash bag now identified as Hennis, the culprit. The defense, however, was quick to attack the case. They questioned the accuracy of the eyewitness testimony, attempting to poke holes in the identifications. They even went as far as to recreate the crime scene to demonstrate inconsistencies in the reports. The defense also argued that there was a lack of direct evidence linking Hennis to the crime. Their first idea was to stage a reenactment to prove that Patrick's eyewitness testimony couldn't be right. They brought in a guy who looked like Hennis and went to the Eastburn house that same morning around 3:30 a.m., just like Patrick had seen it. And they brought a camera, but the other guy couldn't see a thing because it's usually very foggy that time of the night. Nelliger kept digging deeper to prove that their client was innocent and found that the hair and fingerprints didn't add up because nothing matched Hennis, including the shoe prints the officers found at the scene, which were too small for a guy his size. Then their forensic expert, Stambaugh, found a condom wrapper under the dresser that the cops completely missed. This was to prove that the semen sample they found on Mrs. Eastburn could have easily been linked to Gary instead of Hennis. Nelliger wrapped things up by talking to Charlotte Kirby, the newspaper lady who didn't give them much, just that it was raining that morning and she had to bag the papers. Finally, he talked to the neighbors, the Ratkeys, who said they were out walking that morning and didn't see anyone. But a few nights later, they saw the same guy Patrick did. Blonde hair, black beret, a members-only jacket, walking down the street with a garbage bag. But no matter what Hennis' legal team did, the cops weren't convinced because they knew it was Hennis who did it after the evidence and witness reports started piling up. As the trial progressed, the jury was shown horrifying photos of the crime scene to highlight the brutality of the murders. The prosecution's case seemed strong, but without a smoking gun, the verdict was far from guaranteed. After what felt like forever, the jury found him guilty on July 4, 1986, on 1 count of first-degree rape and 3 counts of first-degree murder. Hennis received a death sentence in Cumberland County Superior Court in June 1986, but he's been trying to fight the sentencing ever since. Not long after settling into Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, Tim Hennis got a curious piece of mail, a postcard from someone claiming to be Mr. X, who claimed they did the crime. This was just a ploy for him to try and escape his death sentence. But it didn't work. Hennis' lawyers called it a prank, but they still kept it on file. The prosecution also received a nearly identical postcard, but they also ignored it because the evidence against him was far too much to brush off his sentence. But Hennis' attorneys weren't slouches. They poured hours into appeals, and after more than 2 years on death row, their persistence paid off. The courts overturned his conviction and ordered a retrial, which kicked off on February 27, 1989. The prosecution came prepared with new ammunition, a neighbor named Elisa Peabody. At first, she'd claimed she saw nothing the night of the murders, but now she was certain she'd seen Hennis leaving the scene. The defense came out swinging, ready to dismantle the prosecution's case. The witnesses were forced into rigorous cross-examinations. Lucille Cook, the ATM lady, was first. At first, she saw no one at the machine, but she suddenly identified Hennis. In court, the defense used bank records and timed how long a minute or two actually felt, exposing major inconsistencies. Patrick, the prosecution's star witness, admitted under pressure that he'd been charged with theft using a stolen ATM card, charges that mysteriously disappeared. His friend, Sean Buckner, testified about a letter Patrick wrote, admitting he didn't really know who he'd seen. The defense's secret weapon was John Raupak, a man who was spotted near the Eastburn home. When he took the stand, he looked exactly like Hennis. Raupak described himself as 6 feet 4 inches, wearing a black members-only jacket and dark pants, matching Patrick's exact description of the man he claimed to see. The case against Hennis crumbled, and he was acquitted in 1989. Many thought this was it. The justice system had failed the Eastburn family, but new DNA evidence in 2007 linked him to the crime scene. Double jeopardy laws prevented a state retrial, so the military reactivated the retired sergeant to court-martial him. This time, Hennis admitted that he had slept with Katie with her consent the night of the murders. He claimed that he withheld this detail because he didn't want to hurt the husband's feelings. But the military jury rejected his claims and found him guilty on 3 counts of premeditated murder on April 9, 2010. In 2020, he was put on death row in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, but his conviction and death sentence were upheld. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal in 2021. Case 3. January 15, 1974 was a bitterly cold morning in Wichita, Kansas. At 15 years old, Charlie Otero had no idea that as he walked home from school that day with two of his other siblings, he was stepping into a nightmare, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first thing Charlie Otero noticed was the dog. Lucky was outside. That wasn't right. He and his siblings had just walked home from school, expecting to find their mother waiting, maybe cooking, their father watching the news maybe, their younger siblings playing. Instead, Lucky was out in the cold, pacing. His stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Charlie went straight to the back door, pushing it open. The house was silent, too silent. He stepped into the kitchen, and that's when he saw it. His mother's purse flipped over on the stove, the things inside scattered everywhere. His mother was meticulous. She never left things like this. "Is anybody home?" He called out. Silence. Then, one of his siblings' voices echoed through the house. "Charlie, come quick. Mom and Dad are playing a bad trick on us." The fear in his chest turned into something sharp. He ran down the hall, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. And then his world ended. His father was on the floor. His mother was on the bed, tied up, unmoving, strangled. It didn't even look like them. Charlie's eyes darted across the room, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His father's head was wrapped in plastic, a belt twisted around his throat. His mother's face was frozen in pain, her body tied up in ropes that penetrated her skin. He didn't realize he was screaming until his throat burned. They ran out the door to the neighbor's house. The phone in his shaking hands, the words pouring out in gasps. "Something happened. They're not moving. We need help." The police came. He didn't know how long it took. Time didn't feel real anymore. He was outside when they entered the house, when they found Joey, his little brother, lifeless in another room. And then Josie. She wasn't there. Not in the bedroom, not in the hallway, not anywhere. Until they opened the basement door. Charlie didn't see her. The police wouldn't let him. But they told him later. Josephine, 11 years old, hanging from a pipe. They took him to the station. That's where they told him about Joey and Josie. He didn't remember what he said. He didn't remember if he said anything at all. "I thank God every day that I didn't find them," he would say later, "because I don't know how I would have handled it. I thank God every day that I didn't find Joey and Josie, because I don't know how Michael would have handled it." But even then, even in that moment, he knew. His family was gone, and someone had done this to them. Normal, polite, and well-mannered. That's how people described Dennis Rader. A doting husband, a loving father, and an active member of his community. Rader was just another unassuming neighbor in Wichita, Kansas. He attended church, worked a stable job, and blended in seamlessly. But beneath this facade lurked a monster, a predator who thrived in the thrill of power, control, and death. He was the BTK killer, bind, torture, kill. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He grew up in Wichita, where he presented himself as an ordinary boy. But behind the friendly exterior, dark urges simmered. As a child, Rader took pleasure in torturing and killing stray animals. He fantasized about power, control, and suffering. He later joined the Air Force, then married Paula Dietz in 1971. Together, they had 2 children. By all accounts, Rader was a normal family man. No one knew that, beneath the surface, he was harboring a desire to kill. That desire erupted in January 1974, when he chose his first victims, the Otero family. He had been watching them for weeks, noting Julie's routines, their home's vulnerabilities. Then, on the morning of January 15th, he made his move. Rader cut the phone lines and waited. Joey, the youngest, opened the back door to let the dog in, and Rader slipped inside. He held the Otero family at gunpoint, feeding them a fabricated story that he was a wanted man from California who only needed food and money. But his true intentions were far more ugly than his made-up story. He forced the family into a bedroom, binding each of them with the ropes he had brought. Joseph Otero Sr. fought back, but Rader overpowered him, securing his wrists and feet. Then, he placed a plastic bag over his head. When Joseph chewed a hole through it, Rader tightened another bag over him, watching as he slowly suffocated. Julie Otero's desperate plea came next. "Please save my son," she begged, referring to Joey. Rader removed the bag for a moment, but it was a cruel illusion of mercy. Moments later, he strangled her to death with a rope. Then came Joey. Rader placed a plastic bag over the 9-year-old's head, followed by 2 t-shirts and another bag. He watched as the child thrashed, gasping for air, until he finally went still. But the worst was yet to come. Josie Otero, 11 years old, had witnessed it all. Now Raider led her to the basement. He tied a noose to a pipe and slipped it around her neck. As he pulled the rope, Josie's feet barely touched the ground. "Mama, Mama," she cried. Her long hair got in his way as she struggled. And then, she asked a question that still haunts those who hear it. "What will happen to me?" Raider's response was chilling. "Well, honey, you're going to be in heaven tonight with the rest of your family." He hanged her. He let her toes dangle just above the floor to prolong her suffering as he watched his achievement with utmost satisfaction on his face. Then, as her body went still, he desecrated the scene in the most depraved way imaginable. Dennis Rader evaded capture for 3 decades. When he was finally arrested in 2005, his confession revealed just how twisted his mind was. This particular location, did you know these people? No, that was part of my, I guess my what's called fantasy. These people were selected. Alright, so you. Okay. You were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time. Yes, sir. Alright. Now, when you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure? Sexual fantasy, sir. I see. During his sentencing, prosecutors presented disturbing evidence. Crime scene photos, drawings, trophies he collected from victims. A macabre stash of keepsakes. Rader himself provided a recounting of his crimes very casually, sending chills down the spine of everyone watching, speaking as though he were discussing a hobby. All right, when you went into the house, what happened then? Well, I confronted the family, pulled the pistol, confronted Mr. Otero, and asked him to, that I was there too. Basically, I was wanted. Wanted to get the car. I was hungry, food, I was wanted. And I asked him to lie down in the living room. And at that time, I realized that wouldn't be a really good idea. So the dog was the real problem, so I asked Mr. Otero if he could get the dog out. So he had one of the kids put it out. And I took him back to the bedroom. You took who back to the bedroom? The family. The bedroom. The 4 members. All right, what happened then? At that time, I tied him up, while still holding him at gunpoint. Well, in between tying and yes. Well, after that, I did miss this Otero. I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take. But, was she also tied up there in the bedroom? Yes. Yeah, both her hands and her feet were tied up. She was on the bed. Where were the children? Well, Josephine was on the bed and Junior was on the floor at this time. Basically, when Mr. Otero was down and Mrs. Otero was down, I went ahead and took Junior and put him in a bag over his head and took him to the other bedroom at that time. What did you do then? Put a bag over his head. I put a cloth over his head, a t-shirt and a bag so he couldn't tear a hole in it. And he simply died from that. And then when I went back, Josephine had walked back up. What did you do then? I took her to the basement and eventually hung her. All right, you hung her in the basement? Yes, sir. All right, did you do anything else at that time? Yes, I had some sexual fantasies. But that was... He recalled how he made sure Josie's toes barely touched the ground so she wouldn't die too quickly, how he trained his hands with a squeeze ball to strengthen his grip for strangulation, how he broke into homes disguised as a phone repairman, how he mocked his victims' last words, mimicking their desperate pleas as yada, yada, yada. In a particularly harrowing moment, Rader admitted that he kept meticulous notes on his victims, listing their roles in his sick fantasies. Josie, he wrote, was my star young maiden that I will teach sex to. The courtroom was silent except for the sobs of the victims' families. Charlie Otero, now an adult, broke down when he saw a photo of his sister Josie hanging lifeless in the basement where he had once played as a child. He buried his face in his hands, unable to bear the sight. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, no parole, no escape, just a cell where he would rot for the rest of his miserable life. But for the families of his victims, there was no true closure. I'm Carmen Julie Otero Montoya. Although we have never met, you have seen my face before. It is the same face you murdered over 30 years ago. The face of my mother, Julie Otero. I will not address you as Mr. Rader, because Mr. is a word of respect. As in, Mr., can you help me? Not, Mr., are you going to kill me? BTK is how you want to be known, and I will not give you that satisfaction. Rader is an appropriate name for you, as the one who invades a surprise attack that is nothing to be proud of. Rader, when you took away my mother, you took someone who meant a lot to a lot of people. My mother loved life, her friends, a good laugh, dancing with my dad, and she loved to help people. But most of all, She loved and lived for us, her family. She showed me how to love, to be a good person, to accept others as they are, and most of all, to face your fears. I'm sure you saw that in her face as she fought to live. My mother against your gun. You are such a coward. As one victim's son put it, what do you expect from a demon? The Otero family were not his only victims. On April 4th, 1974, just months after the Otero family murders, Rader struck again. Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old woman living in Wichita, had no idea that a predator was stalking her. Rader had selected her, watched her, learned her routines. When she left her home that day, he made his move, breaking in through the screen door. But things didn't go according to plan. He hadn't expected her 19-year-old brother, Kevin Bright, to be there. Rader pulled out his gun and forced Kevin to restrain his sister, handing him a rope he had brought for this very purpose. Then he took Catherine into another room. She fought him, struggling so much that his usual method of strangulation proved ineffective. Frustrated, he grabbed a knife and stabbed her 3 times in the back and lower abdomen. She bled out, her body giving one final shudder before going still. If I had brought my stuff and used my stuff, Kevin would probably be dead today. I'm not bragging on that, it's just a matter of fact. The bonds I tied him up with, he broke them. Maybe the same way with Catherine. They got out of hand. Meanwhile, Rader attempted to kill Kevin by strangling him and then shooting him in the head. But Kevin refused to die. Clinging to life, he played dead until Rader left. Then, using every ounce of his remaining strength, he managed to escape, running for his life. Unlike the Oteros, Kevin Bright survived. He lived to tell the tale of the man who called himself BTK. But Dennis Rader wasn't finished yet, not even close. On March 17, 1977, Shirley Ruth Relford, who was 25 at the time, was found dead in her Wichita home, the victim of Dennis Rader's twisted fantasies. Rader had stalked her, following her 5-year-old son home to discover their residence. Once inside, he brandished a handgun, the weight of his presence sucking the air from the room. Fear was instant, suffocating. He confined her 3 children, tying them up and locking them in the bathroom. Their muffled cries and frantic pounding on the door did nothing to dissuade him. With precision and what seemed like a lot of practice, he led Relford to the bedroom where sheer terror overwhelmed her, so much so that she vomited. But he didn't care. He bound her legs to the bedpost, restraining her with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this before. Then came the plastic bag, stretched tight over her face, followed by the rope. As he pulled, her body writhed, twisting against the bed, her choked sobs mixing with the muffled screams of her children just down the hall. They begged for their mother, but the monster inside Dennis would not listen to the cries and begs for mercy. He had already decided their fate. He was going to kill them, too. But fate intervened. The children managed to escape before he could carry out the rest of his plan, leaving Rader with only their mother's lifeless body as his trophy. And just like that, he disappeared into the night, slipping back into the mundane world where no one suspected a thing. He was still just Dennis Rader, the polite neighbor, the churchgoer, the family man. But behind closed doors, BTK lurked, waiting for his next victim. Nancy Jo Fox, who was also 25 at the time, was Dennis Rader's next prey. He had been watching her for weeks, following her routine, learning her patterns. She lived alone, an ideal target. On the night of December 8, 1977, Rader approached her home, anticipation burning in his veins. He cut the phone lines before slipping inside, a trick he used for almost every victim. Then he hid in the shadows of her kitchen, waiting. When Nancy finally walked through the door, she had no idea the nightmare lurking within. She barely had time to react before he pounced. With a gun in hand, he forced her into submission, his voice eerily calm as he ordered her to undress. Fear flickered in her eyes, but she obeyed. He bound her wrists and ankles, savoring the control. As she lay helpless on her bed, Dennis tightened a belt around her neck. He squeezed slowly, prolonging her agony. She struggled, gasped, but her fate had been sealed the moment she walked through that door. Before she died, Rader leaned in close, whispering a sick confession. He was the one responsible for the Otero murders. The following day, he called 911 from a payphone, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing," he said, before hanging up. Nancy Jo Fox was dead, and the monster was still free. On February 10, 1978, Rader sent a letter to Wichita television station, KK, claiming responsibility for the murders. He suggested many possible names for himself, including BTK. He demanded media attention in this second letter, saying, How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention? A poem was enclosed, titled Oh, Death to Nancy, a parody of the lyrics to the American folk song called Oh, Death. In the letter, Rader claimed to be driven to kill by what he called Factor X, which he characterized as a supernatural element that also motivated Jack the Ripper, the Son of Sam, and the Hillside Stranglers. He also asked for the police to send him a hidden message. In response, and with the knowledge that the BTK killer watched KK, police decided to flash a subliminal message during one of the station's evening newscasts for a split second. The message stated, "Now call the chief," and featured a drawing of an upside-down pair of glasses, which were found at the Fox crime scene. They hoped the message would influence the killer to turn himself in, but it was unsuccessful. In 1979, Dennis set his sights on Anna Williams, a 63-year-old woman he had become obsessed with. He waited for hours inside her home, growing more impatient by the minute. When she didn't return home in time, he was livid. His perfect plan ruined. Anna Williams unknowingly escaped death that night. His later murders grew more refined, more deliberate. 53-year-old Maureen Hedge was kidnapped from her home in 1985. Dennis Rader took her lifeless body to the church where he was a council president, posed her corpse in twisted positions, photographed her, then dumped her in a ditch. 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle had to go through a similar horror. She was strangled in 1986, lured into a false sense of security by Dennis posing as a telephone repairman. And Dolores Davis, age 62, his final known victim, was murdered in 1991, strangled with pantyhose before being dumped under a bridge. By 2004, the BTK case had gone cold. Police had no leads, no new evidence until Dennis, unable to resist the need for attention, reignited the game himself. Between March 2004 and February 2005, he sent 11 cryptic messages to local media, taunting law enforcement and reliving the times he had made his victims suffer. In March 2004, the Wichita Eagle received a letter from a supposed Bill Thomas Killman, confessing to the murder of Vicki Wegerle in the year 1986. Enclosed were photographs of the crime scene and a copy of Wegerle's stolen driver's license. DNA testing of evidence from Wegerle's fingernails confirmed the BTK killer was responsible. Police began collecting DNA from hundreds of men, but no match was found. Rader continued his sick game, leaving packages at random locations. One contained a bound doll with a plastic bag over its head, mimicking Nancy Fox's murder. In one letter, he wrote, "They know nothing at all. I did it by myself, and with no one's help, I can't stop it. So the monster goes on. Good luck hunting." At the end of the letter, he suggested his own moniker by signing off. "Bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK." Another held a poem threatening lead investigator Lieutenant Ken Landwehr. In January 2005, he left a cereal box in a Home Depot parking lot, hoping it would be found. When it wasn't, he asked about it in his next message. This led police to review surveillance footage, spotting a man driving a black Jeep Cherokee, the same vehicle registered to Rader. But the final mistake, his own arrogance. In February 2005, Rader asked police if a floppy disk could be traced. They responded via a newspaper ad. It would be safe. Taking the bait, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to a news station. Within minutes, police extracted metadata, revealing it had last been edited by Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. A quick search led them to Dennis Rader, who was the president of the church council. His Jeep sat outside his house, confirming what police already suspected. A warrant was issued, but they needed DNA proof. They obtained a PAP smear from Rader's daughter at a Kansas State University clinic. The results confirmed a familial match to the BTK evidence. With this, Dennis Rader was finally arrested. When officers approached him, one asked, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" Without missing a beat, Dennis Rader replied, "Oh, I have suspicions." "Why?" Law enforcement searched his home, office, and church, seizing computer equipment, black pantyhose, and a cylindrical container. The next morning, Wichita Police Chief Norman Williams stepped before the cameras and declared, "The bottom line, BTK is arrested." After his guilty plea, Rader underwent a psychological evaluation by Dr. Robert Mendoza, a forensic psychologist. Mendoza diagnosed him with narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and antisocial personality disorders. Rader exhibited a grandiose sense of self, an obsession with structure and order, a deep need for admiration, and a total lack of empathy. Rader's delusions of superiority made him believe he was special, above the law. A mastermind who had successfully fooled the world. He craved control, not just over his victims, but also in the courtroom, where he narrated his crimes in gruesome detail without a hint of remorse. His interview with Mendoza, intended for court use, was later broadcasted on NBC's Dateline, igniting controversy. The Kansas Attorney General sued Mendoza and his firm for breaching confidentiality, eventually settling the case for $30,000. The evaluation confirmed what the world already knew. Dennis Rader was a remorseless predator, incapable of understanding the emotional devastation he caused. On February 28, 2005, Dennis Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. Initially, he entered a not guilty plea, but on June 27, 2005, he changed it to guilty, detailing each murder so proudly, like an achievement that must be appreciated by the world. At his sentencing on August 18, he delivered a rambling 30-minute apology, which he described as an Academy Awards acceptance speech. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, with a minimum of 175 years. Kansas did not enforce the death penalty at the time. On his way to El Dorado Correctional Facility, he spoke casually with officers about the weather, but began to cry when victim impact statements played on the radio. Now locked away in solitary confinement, he spends his days in a small cell with minimal privileges, a fate far kinder than what he inflicted upon his victims. Dennis Rader's gruesome fantasies and inexplicable crimes has inspired countless works of fiction and true crime adaptations. Stephen King admitted that his novella called A Good Marriage, later turned into a film, was based on Rader's double life. Thomas Harris took inspiration from BTK for the character Francis Dollarhide in Red Dragon. The case has been dissected in episodes of Law and Order SVU, Criminal Minds, and Netflix's Catching Killers and Mindhunter. Even music has explored his crimes, with thrash metal band Exodus writing BTK for their album Blood In Blood Out, and Steven Wilson's haunting track Raider 2 were all inspired by the monster's ill desires and the actions he took to gratify them. But Dennis Rader's crimes do not stop here. In August 2023, authorities discovered a possibility that no one wanted to believe in. Dennis Rader may have had more victims. Investigators discovered possible trophies from additional unsolved cases while searching his former Park City home. The revelations led them to revisit long cold disappearances, including that of Cynthia Dawn Kinney. He confessed to 10 murders almost 2 decades ago. He was known as BTK, a name he gave himself short for bind, torture, kill. He is currently serving life sentences at a maximum security facility in Kansas, and now there is new evidence that may connect the infamous BTK serial killer to additional murders. Arjian Casares spoke to the killer's daughter and got exclusive access to some of his diary entries and drawings. Shortly after Kinney's disappearance, the sheriff's office received an anonymous call. That male caller informed them that she was located in an old barn. No evidence that lead was ever looked into. Her body was never found, but authorities are now looking at this journal entry by Rader. Bad Wash Day. He marked that in 1976 he had murdered someone from a laundromat. For the first time, law enforcement is revealing detailed drawings made by Rader, showing young girls tied and bound in barns. Cynthia, just 16 years old, was last seen on June 23, 1976, at Osage Laundromat in Oklahoma. Witnesses recalled a faded beige 1965 Plymouth Belvedere pulling up before she vanished. Decades later, Sheriff Eddie Verdon connected Rader to the crime after finding an eerie entry in his writings. Bad Wash Day. It was a seemingly innocuous phrase until authorities realized that an ADT alarm system had been installed at a bank across from the laundromat the day Cynthia disappeared. Dennis Rader had been in the area, working as an installer. More disturbingly, Dennis had allegedly confessed in his writings to fantasizing about kidnapping a girl from a laundromat. Despite mounting circumstantial evidence, Dennis denied involvement, possibly fearing the death penalty in Oklahoma. The question remains, how many more victims of his nauseating fantasies are still waiting to be discovered? If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Case 4. On a seemingly ordinary Wednesday, a community is left in shock and a young daughter lost her mom. But as the investigation unfolded, a far more complex story began to emerge, one that raised troubling questions about her life, and some even sympathized with the killer. To understand why, let me take you back to the beginning, on October 13, 2021. On 122 Canebrake Drive, a quiet suburban home, Christina Purcell, a 41-year-old veterinary technician, had a job interview at the Valley Walk Animal Hospital at 8:30 a.m. that morning. She was excited and spoke with her 65-year-old fiancé, Bradley Post, about her upcoming interview. Afterwards, she returned home by 9:07 a.m. When Bradley calls her to ask her how it went, she doesn't answer. By late morning now, he's a little concerned by her silence. And it was around 11 a.m. when Bradley made a horrifying discovery. There was a trail of blood, a long bloody trail as if something had been dragged along. And at the end of this trail lay Christina. He could see her bloodied face and eyes wide open. She was surrounded by what appeared to be roses, scattered rose petals to be exact. Within minutes, police, paramedics, and the deputy arrive. Outside, they meet Bradley. He's well dressed and a blazer's over his clothes. He's cooperative, giving details about how he found Christina. But something about him seems off. He keeps a firm grip on his phone, clutching it along with a towel in the same hand. The officers ask Bradley to accompany them inside. Moments later, she's pronounced dead. The crime scene is gruesome. Evidence of struggle is everywhere. It's clear that Christina fought for her life until the very end. The source of her bleeding appeared to be stab wounds, too many to count at first. Wildflowers and rose petals were scattered across, and there was a large pool of blood beneath the couch. Christina's right hand bore the signs of a fierce fight. Her thumbnail was chipped, and her fingernails were broken, classic indicators of defensive wounds. Investigators carefully collected her fingernails, hoping to find traces of her attacker's DNA. Christina's cell phone lay close to her body. Her purse, containing 2 envelopes with $500 each, was discovered on a table near the hallway, so it's unlikely that robbery was a motive. There was a single-shot firearm in the house, but Christina would not be able to use it because it was locked in a bag within a suitcase in the back room. And in the bedroom, there were multiple documents related to an ongoing custody battle. In the living room were memory cards, several USB drives, and a laptop that were seized for the digital forensics team. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy on Christina Purcell's body stated that her death was due to sharp force trauma, 35 stab and incise wounds, likely caused by a knife. Her jugular vein and carotid artery had been slashed, and she had likely bled out within seconds. But as in cases such as this, a spouse or a lover are the first potential persons of interest to look into. When news of the crime spread, it obsessed local and state media. Head Dr. Dan Randall says she was a key component to their team. Christina brought a unique skill set to the job. She was a mom. She had a fiancé and a sister here in town. She loved her daughter, was extremely close to her sister. And she's not just another nameless, faceless victim. But no other information or leads were mentioned for days. The silence fueled speculation. Then, just 6 days later, on October 19th, Christina's fiancé was arrested. At first, many assumed it was for the murder of Christina Purcell. But it wasn't. He was brought in for questioning, and his phone was searched through a legally obtained search warrant. Investigators found CSAM on his phone. For those who don't know, this is illegal content involving minors. And some of this content involved Christina and her young daughter together. This is a documented fact from the courts. This completely showed a different side of Christina that most people weren't aware of. But during this time, Bradley Post did reveal who might have an incentive to kill Christina. Christina had been having problems for years with the father of her daughter. In fact, she had been blackmailed of revealing photos. Photos that were sent to her neighbors, the bar that she and Bradley frequented, and even her workplace. Christina was actively engaged in a bitter custody dispute with John Mello, the father of her young daughter. John Mello shared custody of his daughter, but he had illegally taken her to Italy to settle there for good. And coincidentally, he flew back to US on October 21st, just 2 days after Bradley Post's arrest. Upon his arrival, Mello was also arrested at the airport for custodial interference related to the illegal abduction of his daughter from the country. John Mello claimed that he had long been aware of Bradley Post and Christina Purcell's involvement in illegal CSAM and the ongoing abuse of his daughter during her visits with her mother. He reported this multiple times to the Greenville County Sheriff's Office in 2018, but the investigation was closed with no action, deeming his accusations unfounded. Christina Purcell and John Mello were dating for years when they had their first child in 2012, but the relationship soured and Mello filed for custody in 2015. In 2016, he was granted sole custody of their daughter, but Christina had visitation rights. A year later, John filed to revoke Christina's visitation rights, claiming that his daughter was being abused by her and Bradley. John also provided evidence gathered from a private investigator that Christina was working as an escort, and this would negatively impact his daughter. In February 2019, the court granted Christina visitation rights, allowing her to spend days at a time with her daughter. However, John Mello had other plans and secretly took his daughter to Italy in late 2020. Christina discovered her daughter's location through John's Facebook posts, and with Bradley's help, made several trips to Italy to find her. She eventually succeeded and brought her daughter back to the United States. Since April 2021, Christina's daughter had been exclusively staying with her and her sister, Litina Parcell. And due to his actions, it's likely that John Mello would lose sole custody of his daughter. From the various storage media and Bradley Post's phone, it's undeniable that Christina's daughter, referred to as AM, had been involved in explicit content spanning several years, which was being distributed to third parties. The content also included other victims, including AM's friend. John Mello had been right about this all along, but neither the authorities nor the courts took him seriously. And as soon as Christina returned to the USA from Italy, Bradley Post proposed to her. One can only imagine the helplessness John Mello must have felt, unable to stop the exploitation of his own daughter by her mother. You might wonder, how did Christina meet Bradley Post? They actually met over 20 years ago at her father's cigar bar. But they hadn't started dating until 2016, when AM was just 4 years old, and John Mello had sole custody of her. While John Mello had motive to end Christina's life, he was out of the country at the time. So who killed Christina Parcell? During the investigation, footage from several cameras, including Ring doorbell cameras, was obtained. A man in a gray hoodie and a backpack was seen entering Christina's house around 9:15 a.m. Just 12 minutes later, at 9:27 a.m., the same man was seen leaving the house on a bicycle. And a minute later, he was spotted on his bike at 207 Saratoga Drive, 0.4 miles from the crime scene. When detectives asked around for who knew John Mello, a man named Michael came forward, and he mentioned that he worked for John, as did another, Zachary Hughes, who helped around the house. Police used Zachary's driver's license to identify a truck registered under his name. Flock cameras captured the truck with a bicycle on it the day before and after the crime. The bike looked like a match for the one captured on camera earlier. Zachary also lived within Greenville city limits at a home on Tyndall Avenue. But it was his closeness to John Mello that drew the investigators' attention, and the men seemed extremely close. Zachary was John's prime contact for various communications, including during his incarceration. John had even recorded a video giving Zachary exclusive rights to pick up his luggage from Charlotte Airport. And through the messaging app WhatsApp, the men had exchanged over 1,700 messages, some of which were intentionally scrambled. Zachary was also very much involved in the bitter custody dispute between John Mello and Christina. He was arrested on November 3rd and charged with a number of crimes: murder, possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime, harassment, conspiracy, and burglary first degree. But this was no ordinary man, and he certainly did not fit the stereotypical profile of a killer. Zachary Hughes was born in Morro Bay, California. His family relocated to Virginia and held strong Christian values of family and children. Zachary has a younger brother, Eli, and his family decided to adopt 5 more Russian children. Because if they didn't, these orphans would have nowhere to go. But one of these adopted siblings, the oldest sister, had a significant influence on Zachary. Was the most evil human being I've ever met in my life. She was 10 when she came into our family. The Russian government didn't tell us much about the kids, so we weren't aware of any, if any, behavioral issues there may have been. And there were many, but specifically with her. I would describe her without reservation as an affectionless psychopath. It wasn't that she was immoral, it was more that she was amoral. She didn't have a sense of right and wrong. Her emotional compass was seemingly non-existent. She was just dead inside. She was a masterful manipulator and deceiver. She could lie at the drop of the hat for reasons that might involve her personal gain, or just for the heck of it. She would invent the most absurd, crazy, gruesome stories just to get a reaction out of people. And she could talk about this stuff with the same tone that you might talk about making a sandwich. And this from a girl that I knew between the ages of 10 to 14. It was incredibly disturbing. And the things I learned about that type of personality have stayed with me my entire life, because I've never met someone like this since. So she was literally like a vampire who would just suck the goodness out of other people around her. She could be very emotional, and she would fake these emotions in order to elicit a response in you, a sympathetic response. And if, for instance, you were accusing her of doing something like stealing or hurting one of her siblings, she would weep and just beg you to believe her and say, no, I didn't do it. And then if you would present her with irrefutable proof that we knew you had indeed done this, it was like a mask would just fall off her face. And I mean, she'd just look at you with sharp eyes. And no matter how many times we would go through this cycle with her, where she would deceive us and betray our trust and hurt people in our family, she would always reel us back in, because there's something in normal, good people that wants to believe that someone like this can change. You want to believe that there's redemption for someone like this, and that they might change their ways and become a better person. And she knew that, and she would use that in order to ingratiate herself again and regain our trust, only to betray that trust again harder than she had the first time. And this happened dozens of times, and it created an incredible amount of strife in our home. She could manipulate my parents and drive a wedge between them. She was just an incredibly intelligent person and incredibly evil. And having met someone like that, it made me able to understand. And even though I didn't want to accept the fact that people like this exist, whether you want to believe it or not, and if you trust them, you're only ever going to get hurt by them again. This experience shaped his motivation for killing Christina, as he saw her as the same type of person. And it finally just got so bad that we realized she was going to be a physical danger to our family. I discovered a diary that she had made where she described in detail my parents having their eyes gouged out and dying, and how once my parents were out of the way and dead, she would be able to assume her role as rightful queen of the country. So she just had these psychopathic delusions of violence and grandeur. And we called the SS and asked them to remove her from the home. Growing up, Zachary turned to playing the piano as an escape from the challenges at home. His talent and dedication led him to win the first place at the Southeastern Piano Festival during high school, earning a solo performance at the South Carolina Philharmonic Orchestra of Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 5. In 2010, Zach's hard work paid off when he was accepted into the Juilliard School with numerous scholarships, where he excelled both academically and socially. Zach would go on to perform one of the most difficult feats for a concert pianist. He celebrated Ludwig van Beethoven's 250th birthday in 2020 by performing all 32 of Beethoven's piano sonatas. When he graduated the Juilliard School in 2015, he applied for and secured the coveted role of a principal keyboardist for the Knoxville Symphony. But he quit all this in 2017 to join the U.S. Marine Corps because, in his own words, he wanted to serve his country. It had just always been something I was interested in, the service of others, service to others aspect of it. I felt like, in a sense, I owed a debt to my country and to do some military service. And I also wanted the opportunity to experience a difficult training environment. And I figured the Marines they had a reputation of being the hardest. So that's the branch I decided to go for. He was offered a place in the Marine Corps band, but refused special treatment. Instead, he opted to enter the grueling officers training program. It's a little different than recruiting. You have to go through a pretty rigorous selection process to even be invited to OCS. So you spend a lot of time with your OSO, or your officer selection officer. And it's their job to essentially train you up and get you ready, so that you can pass the review board to get an invitation. So when I was living in Tennessee, I was doing a lot of training with him preparing for this, and performed exceptionally well. There's something called the PFT, the physical fitness test, and it consists of 3 areas. It's pull-ups to failure, maximum crunches under 2 minutes, and a 3-mile timed run. What's a perfect score on that? You can get a maximum of 100 in each of the 3 areas. So a perfect score would be 300. What was your score? 294. During his training, he consistently placed in the top 3% of his class. However, he had to withdraw. I was dropped after the 3rd week of officer candidate school due to level 3 stress fractures in both of my tibias. At the time you were forced to leave officer candidate school, what percentage of the class were you in? I was in the top 3%. It was more than 400. The CEO of Quantico, which is where Marine Corps OCS is at, asked me to return. He essentially told me to go home, heal, retrain, and come back. It was during this phase of life that he met John Mello. Notably, Zachary had no connections with Christina Parcell or Bradley Post. In fact, they did not know each other personally. What compelled Zachary to throw away his life and promising career? The reasons have divided public opinion. Some view him as an honorable man doing the right thing, while others see his actions as those of a deplorable killer. However, the one undisputed fact is that the system failed to properly investigate and protect AM from abuse. Zachary's trial began on February 10, 2025, and many consider it biased and rigged because the judge ruled all abuse allegations inadmissible in court. The state painted a narrative that Zach acted with malice, completely disregarding a massive influence on his motives. I'm presenting information here that even the jury couldn't see in court. This raised serious questions about why freedom of speech, a core American constitutional value, was disregarded. Even if the abuse allegations were false, if Zach believed they were real, then there's probable cause that he did not act on malice alone. Zachary David Hughes met John Mello in 2020 when he was performing downtown, and John with his daughter approached him. Mello noticed Zach's musical talent and requested he play Claire de Luna for his daughter. She's a really special kid. She was definitely mature beyond her years, like I talked about. She could hold a conversation with adults. She looked you in the eye. She seemed really cultured, like she'd had a lot of exposure to different places. She traveled like almost as much as I had. She was always telling me about trips she and her dad had taken, and it was just very evident to me that she was a very healthy, loved child. She clearly loved her dad, and it was obvious that he had done a great job raising her. I was convinced that she was a happy, healthy kid, and he was a great father. This marked the beginning of their friendship, and they would spend more time together. In early October 2020, they celebrated Zach's birthday. Zach recalled how John's demeanor changed from happy to troubled near the end. John confided in Zach that he was constantly worried for AM, who was on a trip with her mother. Zach listened carefully to John and was understanding of his concerns. He started describing Christina Parcel's character and her personality, and as he was going through various points, he kept saying, "Zach, I know you're not going to believe me. Like, I know this sounds overblown and dramatic, and you probably think I'm exaggerating, and under other circumstances, I would have, because John does, he's a big storyteller, and, when people are talking about their exes, like, everyone thinks their ex is the Antichrist. So, of course, I was sort of predisposed to be biased against what he was telling me, except for the fact that point by point, everything he described about Christina Parcel was exactly the same as my sister Grace. He told me that Christina Parcel was a master manipulator. He said she can lie at the drop of a hat, and you'll never know it. He said she was incredibly charming. He said she was incredibly intelligent and talented. He used to say she was smarter than he was, but that her biggest fault was that she was lazy, and she had this arrogance combined with her laziness that was essentially born out of the fact that she knew she never really had to work too hard at anything in life, and she could even sacrifice trust with people and tell them lies that could easily be found out, because ultimately she was completely confident in her ability to reel someone back in, no matter how bad she had burned them before. And he could have been describing Grace to me, because I knew this behavior. I had lived through this behavior. So no, John had no idea that I'd had this experience with Grace, which made me realize that there was no way he could have possibly invented this, because no one would get it right point by point by point unless they had met one of these people. And that was the first thing that really raised a huge red flag with me, and made me think that despite the fact that he can exaggerate and overblow the truth, and he's often not very believable when you listen to him, I was convinced at that point that he must be describing something true, because no one would know how to describe it so specifically and accurately if they were just making it up. And I was right to believe him. He drew parallels between Christina and his own evil adopted sibling, Grace, who had been removed from the family for plotting to kill Zach's parents. And it finally just got so bad that we realized she was going to be a physical danger to our family. I discovered a diary that she had made where she described in detail my parents having their eyes gouged out and dying, and how once my parents were out of the way and dead, she would be able to assume her role as rightful queen of the country. So she just had these psychotic, psychopathic delusions of violence and grandeur. And we called the SS and asked them to remove her from the home. Over the next few months, even as John Mello flew to Italy, the two men maintained contact and their friendship grew. Zach sensed talent in AM and felt an obligation to protect her. When he learned of the escalating conflict, abuse, and AM's changing demeanor with each visit to her mother's home, he felt morally compelled to act. I realized that there was an incredible danger that what Christina Parcell was a future preview of what AM could potentially become if she was left in this woman's custody and was raised by her. When John moved to Italy with his daughter on October 4th, 2020, Christina filed an order on October 20th, claiming John had violated her visitation rights, which she had. The court appointed a new US-based guardian for the girl and found John Mello in contempt. In March 2021, Christina moved in with her sister to the home in Canebrake Drive. A month later, the Italian Central Authority ruled that AM must be returned to the US. This allowed Christina to retrieve her daughter from Italy. But that's when John Mello began using his friendship with Zachary for personal favors. On April 17th, he asked Zach to harass the S out of Christina and send him a lot of information as proof. He offered me, among other things, 3 very pertinent collections of information. One was the photographs that had been discussed that I sent in mailings to various people, along with advertisements from an escort website, which were connected with these photographs. These photographs were of Christina Parcell in various stages of undress. And John told me that they were prostitution advertisements from her previous career as a prostitute. And looking at these photographs, there was no doubt in my mind that that's what these were. And I don't say this in any way to try to shame. It's simply that, who said it? Pornography, you know it when you see it. Well, I think the same can be said in terms of these photographs. They were not cute, sexy, intimate photographs that someone might send to someone they're dating or something. They were lewd and tasteless. And there was a very clear element of advertising, a commercial element. So when I looked at these, there was a vacant, arrogant, almost derisive look in her eyes that reminded me so much of my sister. It was a look that said, I can get you to do whatever I want because you want what I have to offer you. And coupled with this was a deposition from 2016 that Christina Parcell had given. I believe that, based on various things she freely admitted to in her deposition, that she had a history of using and manipulating men in order to get money and in offering sexual services in return. She admitted to being a pornographic actress and producing a film in South Carolina where she rubbed her feet on a man's penis, with this emphasis on it being a trade, essentially a reciprocal thing, where she was seeking out to be taken care of financially. She said that she had a general disinterest in having children at the time, which is why she gave up custody of her daughter to John Mello when her daughter was very young. And a court document from 2016 where she pleaded the fifth when asked about her involvement. But the point was much more than just showing Zach that she was an unfit parent for AM. On May 16th, John sent Zach 2 explicit photos of Christina under her online alias, Caroline Warren, which she used to lure men to pay for her services. This included an affidavit from a firefighter named Alex. John posted an ad on Craigslist asking for information about a woman named Christina Lorraine Parcell, aka Caroline Warren, and he provided photographs to identify her by. This advertisement on Craigslist? Yes. Who claimed that Christina had offered him her services in exchange for money, and when he refused, she tried again with drugs. Zach visited Mello in Italy that same month. When you arrived in Italy, where did you stay? I stayed at John Mello's apartment, and I'm sure things that weren't said in messages were discussed there. John had video visits ordered by the guardian ad litem. Often I would be able to observe the screen of his phone or computer, so I could see his face, her disposition. And on one occasion I said hi to her. So John had been telling me for weeks, Zach, Christina's killing my little girl. Like I can see the spark dying in her eyes. And again, when I first heard that, I thought, aren't you being a little dramatic? Like I hadn't seen her, but it just seemed a bit much. When I saw her in these visits, I didn't feel that way anymore. She was not the same little girl that I had known in Greenville when I first met them. She had put on a great deal of weight, probably about 20 pounds, which is roughly a quarter of her body weight. For an 8-year-old girl, that's a lot in a short period of time. But it was much more than that. It was her demeanor. Her spirit was just, she was morose. She was depressed. Like that spunky, precocious, lively little girl that I had met was just not present there. It was a complete change in character. And, John would ask her how she was doing, and she would always try to give a good response. Like she would try to smile and say, "Oh, I'm fine, Daddy," and try to put on a good face. But it was clear that she was doing that because she didn't want to worry her dad. She didn't want him to realize how poorly she was doing. And it just reminded me so much of myself when I was a little older than she was with what I've previously described with Grace. It's this, you internalize things. Like she's a strong person, and she was trying to be stronger than she was probably ready to be at that age. And despite the stoic, strong exterior she was trying to put on, I could just see that she was being tortured, like she was drowning. And him saying that the spark was dying in her eyes was absolutely accurate. I could see it. I could hear it in her voice. I could tell it in her demeanor. When Zach returned to the United States, he did harass Christina by distributing her explicit images to multiple locations, including a workplace at Norris Financial, to 2 of her neighbors, to her fiancé Bradley, and at Outman Cigars and Martini Bar, a place frequented by Bradley and Christina. It contained information that I believe had been put out publicly and by Christina Parcells' free will. So this was all information that had been available publicly, and that to the best of my knowledge was true. And I began to send these mailers to Christina Parcells and her boyfriend and people in the neighborhood for a threefold purpose. I wanted parents around that neighborhood to know that their children were not safe around her or around Rad Post. I wanted different people associated with this, such as the going handle item, the police, to have access to this information, so that they would have all the evidence that I was looking at that clearly demonstrated that Christina Parcells was a danger to children and her own daughter. And I also wanted there to be social pressure, again, about people like Grace and Christina Parcells, as the facade that they erect around themselves and the image that they put forward to the world is so important to them. They're narcissists, and it is a facade. It's completely untrue. But I was hoping that it wouldn't be worth it to her, for other people to see her for what she was, in exchange for her trying to fight to have her daughter. In September, a month before the crime, Zach called Child Protective Services, admitting in his testimony that he lied to get their attention, so they would investigate Christina and Bradley. It's unclear if this ever led to an investigation. Shortly after these mailers would have arrived, John described a call to me where he said Christina was, at the end of the call, she took the phone and turned it towards her face, which she usually did not do. And he said she was more angry than I've ever seen her. And he would often talk about how you would never see her angry, like she was very good at controlling her emotions and not showing if you had made her angry. And she took the phone and didn't say anything, but just slid her finger across her throat, as if she was threatening that she was going to have him killed for what she believed he was doing. He stated that John Mello believed Bradley Post was a PDF file, and he believed it as well. He sent it to me, an email he had received from someone he knew in the biker community, motorcycles. And Brad Post was also involved in the biker community, or at least tried to be. And this email was from this acquaintance of John, telling John that Brad Post had been going around essentially asking for someone to, quote, put the hurt on John Mello, and that he was offering a lot of money to make this happen. Zach revealed that John Mello initially offered him $5,000 to end Christina's life. John asked me that if I believed his daughter was in grave danger, would I be willing to kill Christina Parcells for $5,000? What did you say when he asked you that? I was shocked and insulted by the request, and I gave him an immediate and unequivocal no. The second offer, he asked me again, if I became convinced that his daughter was in danger, would I be willing to kill Christina Parcells for $10,000? I told him, John, there's no amount of money that would ever tempt me to do something like this. And I told him I was insulted, that he even thought that would be something I would consider. So I told him I would never do something like this for money. I told him the only way I would ever consider taking action like this is if I was absolutely convinced that his daughter was not only in danger, but that the only way to rescue her from that danger would be to take Christina Parcells' life. I can't help but wonder if being homeschooled and somewhat protected from the real world had led Zach to be pressured and exploited by John Mello to commit premeditated murder. From his testimony, it's clear that Zach portrays Christina as an evil, immoral woman, similar to how he views his oldest sibling. The defense presented a case that he did this as a last resort to prevent a child's life from being ruined, because his dear friend John Mello had tried everything, including leaving the country. During videos of the trial and his testimony, many people in the comments felt the same way. But there's another side to this case. A woman was brutally murdered in her own home, and people seem to disregard what she went through. Sure, she may not have been an angel, but did she deserve what happened to her? I was having this incredible wrestling match within myself for these months, feeling that I needed to do something to save her, and yet feeling this incredible reluctance to do the one thing that I knew would save her, because of how terrible I knew it would be to do it, even though I believed it would be right. By the time October 13th rolled around, I had been grappling with this for a long time, and I was experiencing a tremendous amount of guilt that I had waited as long as I did, because I should have acted sooner, and I didn't do that. So I had come to the realization that I had gotten this offer to go on this cruise ship, and I would have been leaving the country for a long time. Essentially, it was now or never. I had an opportunity to save her from a danger that I knew she was in, and that I knew was not going to cease. I just couldn't go on with my life and leave her to drown. I mean, I had a great life. I had everything. I made money doing what I loved. I was going to be going to the South Pacific to play concerts for rich people on cruise ships. I mean, but how could I go and enjoy that and know that I was leaving a kid to her fate, a kid who thought that I was her friend? I would never have been able to look at myself in the mirror again if I had done that. The murder itself was premeditated, no doubt. Specific to October 13th, I believed that there would be a period of time at the house when Christina Purcell would be alone, and I wanted to make sure that absolutely no one was there, not Ludna, not Brad Post, because again, this was not about revenge or retribution or anything. I wasn't angry. The only thing I was feeling that day was pity. I planned very carefully. I knew that if I tried to do this and failed, it would only be worse for me, because I believed that if I was discovered doing this, it would connect me to John Mello. And I believed, and I still believe, that he's a great father, and he is best shot at having a happy and safe childhood. Like, I knew that it was right logically, but the emotional aspect was just reeling against this idea, and more so because she was a woman. I was raised to always protect my sisters and mother, and I opened doors for women growing up. So this idea was just repugnant to me, even though I believed it was necessary to save a child. And I had felt that this was the right thing to do, no matter how terrible and difficult it was going to be. I had a duty to do this to save a child. Physically driving my truck there, I was experiencing a level of anxiety and physical illness that I had just never experienced due to stress before. My hands were shaking. I was in a cold sweat, and I was fighting the urge to vomit before I even got close there. A few times I thought I was going to have to pull off to the side of the road because I could hardly keep my truck straight. My hands were shaking so badly. But the whole time I was just thinking, if I don't do this, if I turn back, then I'm consigning to her fate when I know that I could have done something to stop what was happening. So I just tried to take my mind off of it, and I tried to just go and drive a little bit farther, not think about what I was going to have to do when I got there. When I finally got to the point where I parked my truck, this feeling only increased. I knew the plan, but I was having so much difficulty going through with it. I took my bike out of the truck, and I had a mask on and clothing that's been described already. And I just tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other on my bike. It felt like some runs or rucks I had been on where all I could do was focus on putting one foot in front of the other because it was so difficult to keep going. I just kept seeing her face and reminding myself that if I don't do this, no one's going to come to save her. And I kept pedaling, and eventually I arrived in front of 122 Cambridge. Initially, were you going to use the gun? Yes. I was very concerned about using a gun because of how loud it would be, and I didn't want to alert a neighbor or a bystander who might come to investigate and get involved. I tried to suppress the gun by making a makeshift suppressor. In movies, these things are made out to be like it's very easy, and a suppressed gun is just very silent, and that's not the case. So ultimately, I test-fired the gun. I had bought some subsonic ammunition, which is supposed to be quieter. I didn't realize that on a revolver, the suppressor doesn't work because the end of the cylinder is open. And I realized just a day or two beforehand that I couldn't use a gun because it could potentially involve someone else in this if someone heard a gunshot and came to investigate. I would have rather not to have done it at all, but if I had to, yes, I would have chosen a gun because it would have been quicker and more humane. I had on black pants and a black thermal and a gray shirt over that. I had on a black beanie and a white medical mask, and I had on black gloves and a black backpack. When you arrived at the house and you got off your bike, what did you do? I laid my bike down in the driveway, and I took my backpack off, and I took out the box that had been gift wrapped that had an end open, and I put the .22 revolver in that box, put the backpack back on my back, and I took a bunch of roses, and I walked up to the door, and I rang the doorbell. And I was shaking and freaking out at this point, because there was nowhere I wanted to be less than at that house on that morning. And when I rang the doorbell, the door opened, and a woman came to the front, and I thought it was Christina Purcell, but I wanted to make sure, and I also wanted to make sure that no one else was home. So I told her that while I was holding the box and the roses, that I had a delivery for Ludna Purcell, her sister, and she told me that Ludna wasn't home. At this point, I realized that Christina was at the house alone, and I handed her the roses, and I took the revolver out of the box, and I pointed it at her, and I told her to be quiet and to go back into the house, which she did. And I followed her into the house, and I shut the door. And I was experiencing such anxiety that my body wasn't really doing what I was telling it to do anymore. When I realized that I couldn't use the gun, which was unloaded at this point, my plan had been to try to knock her unconscious, because I didn't want to cause her or anyone any pain. That wasn't my intention. I just wanted to save her, and to make sure that no one else who was a bystander would be involved in this or could be endangered in any way. So I tried, while she was holding the roses, to strike her on the head and knock her unconscious. But my body was fighting me, because even though I knew who she was and what she was doing and the danger that was putting her in, I was still looking at her, and I was seeing a sympathetic figure. I was seeing a woman, and I had always been taught never to hurt a woman, to always protect women and children. So when I went to strike her with the gun, my hand didn't really do what I was trying to tell it to. I essentially pulled my strike. So when I struck her on the head with the pistol, that's what happened. It didn't knock her unconscious, and I hardly struck her at all, to be honest. So I tried again, and the same thing happened. I just couldn't bring myself to strike her. And at this point, she realized that I was hesitating. She began to try to move herself and to get away and to fight back. During this period of time, the roses had dropped and the petals and stems had scattered. And as I was hesitating, I realized that this situation was quickly getting out of control. And if I didn't pull myself together and act soon, this was all going to end up terribly. I was going to have to somehow force myself to do this at any cost. So I pulled out the knife I was wearing, and even though I knew I wasn't going to be able to strike her with any amount of force, I still tried. So I started striking her. My strikes were pulled. The knife made contact with her, but it wasn't stopping her, and it wasn't inflicting anything that could be a fatal blow. And she started to fight back, and it became a struggle. And in this struggle, all I could do was try to overcome this resistance I had, physical and emotional resistance to doing it. So I just kept striking her until finally we fell on the floor. And at this point, I had just tried to take my mind out of it and just try to get through this and finish it as quickly as possible, because I realized that it was only becoming prolonged, and I had to do this in order to save her. So I don't remember how many times I struck her. I just remember that when it finished, we were on the ground. And I stopped striking her when she stopped struggling. And at this point, I stood up, and I was still freaking out, and I was in kind of a daze. And I was just trying to pull myself together and figure out what I needed to do to leave the house. And again, I wanted to make sure that I didn't leave anything behind that would connect me to it, because then I believed John would be connected to it. So I quickly looked around to make sure I hadn't left a mask or a glove, and I started to pick up the rose petals and realized that I just didn't have time to do that. So I drew the blinds, and I moved her body away from the door, which had windows, because I didn't want someone to come to the door and see her. I put my things back in the backpack. I looked in a mirror to make sure everything was in order, and I saw that she had scratched my face. And of course, I realized that this could leave DNA, so I used the paint thinner to try to clean her hands. And then I changed my mask, and I took off my outer shirt because there was blood on it, and I put it in the backpack. I was trying to leave the house as quickly as possible. That paint thinner could explain that strange smell in the house, but despite Zach's attempts, his DNA was found under Christina's fingernails. I prayed again, and just said that I believe that what I've done is the right thing, and I believe that I did it for the right reason. If it's your will that I be connected to this, then I will turn myself in, and I will own up to what I've done, and I'll take responsibility for it, because I believe that it was the right thing. And then I left. I exited out through the door, and I got back on my bike, and I pedaled my bike back to the truck, and I drove back to the mountain house. But the jury never saw his testimony in its entirety, as they were asked to leave the room several times. I felt the most enormous wave of relief wash over me, because I knew from that moment on it would be safe, that her mother was perpetrating on her, and there is proof to that the state is hiding from you. It's just going to be quiet. You need to stop talking. After the trial, the juror claimed that what they were able to see actually hurt the defense. They saw Zach as a cold, calculating, and remorseless killer, which strengthened an otherwise weak case of malice presented by the prosecution. It wasn't that she was immoral, she was immoral, Hughes told the jury. She was dead inside, a master manipulator and deceiver. She could lie at the drop of a hat. His statement gave a view of his motivation to commit the crime. I realized the incredible danger. That Christina Parcell was a glimpse into their child's possible future, if she remained in her custody, he said. And the facts have proven that I was right. On the same day as Zach's testimony, John Mello was arrested at 1:30 p.m. for orchestrating the murder of Christina Parcell and offering Zach money twice to kill her. John was denied bond at a hearing a few hours later, with the judge ruling that another court would take up the matter within 30 days. It's my understanding that Tina Parcell is in the courtroom. Tina, as I understand it, you're the sister of the victim. Is that correct, ma'am? Would you like to say anything to the court in reference to this proceeding? During the hearing, Christina's sister, Tina Parcell, made an emotional statement holding Christina's ashes. I brought Christina because she deserves to be here. We have waited 1,224 days for this. And I wish I could tell you it felt good, John, but it's not going to feel good yet. You did this to your family. Your child has to know that you did this to her family. You did this to your family. Your child has to know that you did this to her family. I don't know where I am when you hear the trial, but I assure you that if I do my all in the court, I will be better every day. When you are convicted, I will be there at every parole hearing. Every one. You will never get rid of me. And that is your own fault. You did this to yourself. All right, sir, you're free to go with the officer. And herself had told her psychiatrist she did not want to stay with her aunt because she felt that her aunt was taking photos of her when she was undressed. But these allegations remain unproven. Yes, I made a phone call to Child Protective Services, and I told them that I was a neighbor. I told them that I had seen my aunt being verbally and physically abused by her mother. And again, I made that up. That's not true. But I said it because I wanted to give her an opportunity to have FaceTime in person with an agent from DSS away from her mother, where she could tell them that her mother was sexually abusing her. As to the charge of murder, we the jury find the defendant guilty. As to the charge of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime, we the jury find the defendant guilty. As to the charge of burglary, first degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty. As to the charge of harassment, first degree, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. As to the charge of harassment, second degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty. As to the charge of conspiracy to commit harassment, first degree, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. As to the charge of conspiracy to commit harassment, second degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Signed by our foreperson. He wanted to kill someone. He was given a target on a silver platter. He was given an address, a date, a time. And he planned it. He knew that if he planned it just enough, he would never get caught. He planned it so much that he thought, well, even when I got caught, I got this. I can still get out of this. Without remorse, without rehabilitation, any person that goes through that effort to commit a murder would absolutely do it again to see if they could. You're left with either two options. Either he's a weak, easily manipulated man who would kill anybody that anyone asked him to, or he's not. And if that's the case, then he absolutely would do this again to see if he's smart enough this time, to see if he can beat it this time, because he has shown no respect for the law of this courtroom. All of these men did nothing but use my sister. John Mello used her to create a whole new family when he had a wife and children already. Brad Post used her. This defendant used her. All of them used her for their own twisted personal gratification. He would do it again. Without remorse, without rehabilitation, you will have recidivism. Thank you, Your Honor. The next day, on February 20th, 2025, Zachary Hughes was sentenced to life in prison. His lawyer is appealing, and one of the jurors later stated that had he known the full picture of the abuse allegations and Zach's true motivations to commit the crime, it would have definitely influenced the jury. He felt that the entire case was a mistrial due to the conditions and exclusions set by the judge. Case 5. Back in 1977, this little town had a population of just over 6,500 people. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, and the charm of rural life created a sense of peace and safety. This close-knit vibe might seem like a small detail, but trust me, it plays a key role in what unfolded later. Now let's talk about the Bedoin household, because it wasn't just your typical family. There were 10 people living under one roof. At the head of the family was Frederick Bedoin, the father, and Cheryl, the mother, who was only 29 at the time. Together, they had 7 children ranging from toddlers to pre-teens. The eldest, 12-year-old Frederick Jr., was followed by 10-year-old Sharon Lee, 9-year-old Deborah and 8-year-old Paul, 6-year-old Roderick, 5-year-old Holly Lynn, and 4-year-old Mary Lou. If that wasn't enough, their 6-year-old niece, Jennifer Santoro, also lived with them. With so many young lives in the mix, their home must have been a lively and chaotic place, full of the everyday ups and downs of a big family. And as you can imagine, the Bedoin family had a pretty lively and fun time together. And that was definitely true on the night of Thursday, July 21st, 1977. The 8 kids were enjoying themselves, swimming and playing around in their neighbor's pool in Prospect, Connecticut. The air was filled with laughter, splashes, and carefree moments, just a typical summer evening. Now life for they weren't struggling either. They had enough to get by and were grateful for what they had. Despite not being wealthy, they created a warm, loving home that radiated happiness. On that particular night, Cheryl, the mom, was keeping an eye on the kids while they were having a blast at the pool. Meanwhile, Frederick Bedoin, the father, was working his 3rd shift at the Pratt & Whitney factory, trying to provide for his family. But then, things took an unexpected turn when a man showed up at the pool. Now, this man was no stranger. In fact, the kids were thrilled to see him. The neighbor recalled how they all rushed over to greet him, showering him with hugs and kisses. It was clear that he was someone they knew well and trusted. After a little while, the kids wrapped up their fun in the pool and went home with this man while the neighbor went inside, and the evening continued as it would for any other family. But little did anyone know, this night would soon take a dark and tragic turn that would change everything forever. Around 4:15 in the morning, the quiet of the early hours was shattered when neighbors started to smell smoke. At first, they thought it might be someone burning leaves or trash. But then they heard something far more alarming, screams coming from the Bedoin house. That's when they realized something was seriously wrong and quickly called 911 to report the fire. Fire trucks from both Prospect and the nearby town of Bethany rushed to the scene, sirens piercing through the night. The firefighters worked tirelessly, and after about 30 minutes, they managed to extinguish the blaze. But what came next was something no one could have prepared for. As the smoke cleared and the flames died down, firefighters began searching the house. Inside, they discovered an unspeakable tragedy. The bodies of Cheryl Bedoin, her 7 children, and her 6-year-old niece Jennifer Santoro were found throughout the home. Each one had been brutally killed before the fire. Cheryl's charred body was found on the kitchen floor. 3 of the children were discovered in one bedroom, while 2 more were in another. 1 child was found in the master bedroom, and 2 more were located in the bathroom. The scene was nothing short of horrifying. Adding to the nightmare, many of the victims, including Cheryl, had their hands tied behind their backs. 2 of the children had their feet bound, and everyone appeared to have suffered severe head injuries before the fire consumed their bodies. It was a crime of unimaginable cruelty, and the sheer brutality shocked even the most experienced investigators. All of the bodies were burned extensively, said Edward P. Leonard, the state police commissioner at the time. His statement only hinted at the unimaginable horror that firefighters and police had witnessed. Some neighbors later admitted they had woken up to the smell of smoke, but didn't immediately think much of it. It wasn't until they heard the chilling screams that they realized the danger and called for help. One neighbor, Joseph Polino, tried to help. He ran to the Bedoin house and attempted to enter, but the fire was already too intense. He later recounted the terrifying scene, saying, "I opened the back door and got driven back by a blast of heat. Then the picture window blew out." As mentioned earlier, Frederick Bedoin, the father of the family, was at work at the Pratt & Whitney factory in North Haven, working the 3rd shift. Around 5:30 in the morning, police arrived at his workplace to pick him up. They didn't tell him what had happened, only that he needed to come with them. They drove him to his mother's house, where the family's Reverend Joseph Donnelly was waiting to deliver the devastating news. After hearing it, Frederick turned to Reverend Joseph with a question that no parent or spouse should ever have to ask. "Are they all dead?" Joseph's somber response confirmed his worst fears. Everything Frederick held dear, his wife, his children, his entire family, was gone in one horrifying night. Shattered by grief, he reportedly said through tears, "There's only one thing, to see the bastard pay." But while Frederick was dealing with this unimaginable loss, investigators were already working tirelessly to find answers. They set up a command post at Prospect Town Hall and began stopping every car traveling along Route 68. They were determined to leave no stone unturned. Additionally, back at the Bedoin home, police continued their investigation. That's when they noticed something strange. All the doors and windows were locked. This raised an alarming question. How could the killer have escaped if everything was locked from the inside? It pointed to the chilling possibility that whoever committed the crime was already inside the house, or somehow locked the doors behind them. Naturally, the investigators started talking to neighbors. That's when they learned about a man named Lorne Ackwin, the very same man who visited while the kids were enjoying their time at the neighbor's pool. But that wasn't all. The neighbors said they saw him again early Friday morning, sitting alone in a black sedan parked in a nearby church parking lot about a mile from the house. This information raised red flags for the investigators. Who was this man? And why was he hanging around the house before and after the tragedy? The neighbors filled in more details about Lorne's connection to the Bedoin family. As it turns out, he wasn't just some random figure on the periphery of their lives. For about 2 years, he had actually lived in their basement. Then, out of the blue, he vanished from their lives. But just as abruptly as he had disappeared, he reappeared on that fateful Thursday night, the same night the Bedoin kids had been swimming at the neighbor's pool. Meanwhile, investigators couldn't afford to overlook anyone, not even Frederick, the grieving father. In the early stages of any investigation, the people closest to the victims are often scrutinized. So when officers asked Frederick for permission to search his truck, he didn't hesitate. He had nothing to hide. The search came up clean, no evidence, no suspicious items. But it was a necessary step in ruling him out. By the time the investigation hit the 24-hour mark, it was already a whirlwind of activity. Police weren't wasting a second. They had set up roadblocks, spoken to neighbors, and interviewed over 100 witnesses, including both Frederick and Lorne. Every detail was critical, and no piece of information was too small to be considered. However, when officers ran Lorne Ackwin's name through their system, what they uncovered was far more troubling than anything they had heard from the neighbors. This wasn't just a man with a few minor run-ins with the law. His criminal record revealed a pattern that painted him as someone with a dangerous, unpredictable streak. In April of 1974, Lorne was sentenced to prison for larceny. He served less than a year before being released in February of 1975, but freedom didn't suit him for long. By March of 1976, he was back behind bars after attempting to escape custody, a desperate and reckless act that hinted at his bold, unrestrained nature. After serving time for that charge, he was paroled in September of 1976. Now here's the part that truly raised red flags. When the tragedy at the Bedoin house happened, Lorne had only been out of prison for 7 months. 7 months, that's hardly enough time to rebuild a stable life, let alone prove himself as a changed man. And yet, here he was, connected to the scene of one of the most devastating crimes the community had ever witnessed. For investigators, the timing and circumstances surrounding Lorne's reappearance were impossible to ignore. His criminal past, combined with his strange behavior in the days leading up to the tragedy, created a picture that was hard to dismiss. Why had he returned to the Bedoin home after being gone for so long? Why was he spotted sitting in a black sedan in a nearby church parking lot the morning after the fire? To make matters even more intense, investigators uncovered a shocking twist. Lorne wasn't just some random person with a criminal past. He was actually Frederick's foster brother. Talk about a wild turn of events. On the morning of July 22nd at around 9:30 a.m., investigators went over to Lorne's apartment, asking him to come in for questioning. To everyone's surprise, he agreed without hesitation. He calmly went with them to the police station, but what happened next took everyone off guard. Lorne didn't just answer questions, he laid it all out. He was ready to confess, and he didn't just give some vague or wishy-washy response. Instead, he gave a chilling, detailed account of the crime that sent shivers down everyone's spine. He admitted to attacking his sister-in-law and the children. To make sure they were on the right track, police didn't just stop at one round of questioning. They asked him the same questions 3 different times, and each time, his story stayed exactly the same. Even when they brought in his psychiatrist to talk to him, Lorne didn't back off from his confession. At this point, it was clear as day. Lorne was the one responsible. He was arrested and charged with 9 counts of murder and 1 count of arson. But the investigators weren't taking any chances. They made him write up a full confession, a 7-page document that spelled out every detail of what had happened. The facts were so specific and accurate that no one else could have known them, certainly not from the news or outside sources. It was all from Lorne himself. But that's not where the story ended. Later that day, on July 23rd, investigators found even more damning evidence. A trash bag filled with bloody clothes was found near Lorne's driveway, and even more chilling, bloody shoes and socks were discovered in the trunk of his car, the very same car that people had seen him parked in at the church the night of the crime. All of this lined up perfectly with what Lorne had confessed. The evidence was stacking up like a mountain, pointing directly at him. But if you'd think that at this time the case was closed and Lorne is locked up for good, well, not quite. Things were about to take another unexpected turn. Even though everything seemed to be going in the direction of a quick conviction, Lorne's defense team wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. They were still looking for ways to create doubt, to turn the tide in their favor. While the evidence against him was stacking up, his confession, the bloody clothes, the witnesses, his lawyer was fighting tooth and nail to poke holes in the prosecution's case. John R. Williams wasn't going to let it slide without putting up a serious challenge. Even with everything seemingly pointing to Lorne's guilt, the defense team started pushing for a delay, arguing that the court had overstepped by requesting a blood sample from Lorne without solid evidence. They wanted the confession and the blood evidence excluded from the trial, and they tried to introduce new theories like the possibility that Cheryl's brother might be the real killer. But the court wasn't buying it. They saw the evidence for what it was: clear, consistent, and chilling, and refused to allow the defense to shift the focus elsewhere. The trial continued as planned, and when the jury was finally sworn in on July 16, 1979, it felt like the final chapter was getting closer. Then came the day everyone had been waiting for, the public reveal of Lorne's confession. And let me tell you, it didn't disappoint. It was a detailed, gruesome account of everything he had done. Lorne confessed to killing Cheryl, her children, and others, describing each moment with cold precision. He even talked about how he went to the house in the evening to pick raspberries with the kids before the violence began. It was hard to believe, but Lorne's story didn't end there. According to him, after leaving the house around 8:30 p.m., he came back in the early hours of the morning, around 2 or 3 a.m., slipping inside through the unlocked basement door. Once in the kitchen, he casually turned on the light, and that's when Cheryl came down to see what was going on. According to Lorne, she didn't seem too surprised to see him, and when he asked to grab some tools from the basement to fix his car, she let him go without a second thought. But things quickly took a deadly turn. After getting the lug wrench, Lorne came back upstairs and asked Cheryl for a beer. She didn't think anything was off about it. After all, he was family, right? But the moment she turned her back to get the beer, Lorne hit her over the head with the lug wrench. And that wasn't the end of it. He kept swinging, hitting her over and over again without hesitation. The worst part? Lorne claimed Cheryl didn't make a sound. She didn't scream, didn't cry for help. I can't even imagine what was going through her mind at that moment. Was she trying to stay quiet so she wouldn't alert her children? Was she hoping to survive this attack without drawing attention? Unfortunately, it didn't work. One of the kids heard the noise and rushed to the kitchen, only to be struck by Lorne with the same wrench. From there, he went on to attack the other children, using the wrench and a tire iron. But when he heard Cheryl moaning in the kitchen, meaning she was still alive despite the brutal blows, he went back and started stabbing her. Lorne later confessed to the police that he tied up some of the children with string and then tragically assaulted 10-year-old Sharon before killing her. Just think about the horror this poor child experienced. Beaten senseless and then assaulted at just 10 years old. After all of that, he drenched everyone, Cheryl and the children, in gasoline and set the entire house ablaze. However, when Lorne took the stand on September 5, 1979, his story took a complete turn. He denied everything he had confessed to. He said, "I didn't do any of that." He claimed that he only signed the confession because his psychiatrist told him it would be better for him. According to Lorne, the psychiatrist had said, "You'd be better off if you signed." Lorne also claimed that he repeatedly requested a lawyer during his interrogation, expressing his desire to speak with one over and over. However, the police repeatedly denied his requests, insisting that they already knew he was guilty. They urged him to simply confess, convincing him that it would be better for him if he did. When questioned about the blood stains on his clothes, Lorne offered an unusual explanation. He claimed that the blood wasn't from the murders, but from a fight he had gotten into the night of the killings. According to Lorne, he had been out for coffee when some men outside the cafe attacked him. In retaliation, he said he fought back and ended up beating them. That's where the blood came from, he insisted. It was a strange and highly unlikely story that left many people skeptical of his account. The situation took an even more bizarre turn when Lorne described his reaction upon learning about the murders. He stated that when the police first informed him about the killings, he was so enraged that he punched a wall in the police barracks. He claimed that in his anger, he warned the state trooper, telling him that they'd better catch the killers before he did. Now, during the trial, the prosecutors introduced a photo of the 7 murdered children, showing their innocent faces, which had never been seen by the jury before. This photograph led Lorne's lawyer to argue for a mistrial, suggesting that the emotional impact of the image could unfairly influence the jury's opinion. However, the judge dismissed the motion, and the trial continued without interruption. As the case progressed, certain pieces of evidence seemed to lend some credibility to Lorne's version of events. For instance, the way he reacted when first informed of the murders mirrored exactly what he had claimed in his confession. This alignment raised questions about whether he had actually committed the crimes or if he had been coerced into admitting to them. Moreover, a state police fingerprint expert testified during the trial that the bloody handprint found in the bathtub wasn't Lorne's. In fact, the handprint on one of the door jambs didn't match his either. This revelation raised further doubts about his involvement, particularly since the prints didn't match any of the victims, or even Frederick, the father. There was also the matter of a prior interview with Lorne conducted in October of 1977 by reporter Lincoln Milstein from the local newspaper The Current. This interview, which had been kept under wraps until the confession was released, revealed even more contradictions. Lorne admitted to Milstein that he had no recollection of the killings. The only things he remembered were vague snippets, talking to Cheryl, seeing bodies and blood everywhere, and the house being on fire. He claimed that he had been so frightened and confused by what had happened that he didn't remember the events clearly. However, things took a turn in October 1977, when Lorne was transferred to a state mental hospital in Middleton for security reasons, and a few weeks later he was officially committed. A psychiatrist testified that he might be suffering from schizophrenia or epilepsy, raising doubts about his mental state at the time of the confession. With this in mind, some argued that his statements were unreliable, and this further questioned his accountability for the crimes. Fast forward to October 1979. The jury deliberated for hours over the course of 3 days before finding Lorne guilty on all counts of murder. They did not charge him with SA, despite speculation that he might have been driven to kill after feeling ashamed of allegedly molesting one or more of the Bedoin girls. Chief Assistant State's Attorney Walter Scanlon suggested this could have been the motive, although it was never definitively proven. The state tried to get the maximum possible prison sentence of 245 years, which is 25 years for each murder and 20 years for arson, but Judge Walter Pickett sentenced Lorne to 105 years to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 or 55 years. The decision was made, but it didn't take long before Lorne's attorney filed an appeal, so quickly in fact, that it seemed as though the appeal had been pre-written and ready to go. However, the court denied his appeal, and Lorne was sent to prison. Over the years, Lorne continued to fight his conviction, filing petitions for a habeas corpus trial. Despite his efforts, each petition was rejected, and his legal battles seemed to go nowhere. And for those unfamiliar with the term habeas corpus, it refers to a writ used to bring an accused person from a different jurisdiction to the court in the place where the crime occurred, essentially allowing for the review of the case. In Lorne's case, he argued that he was wrongfully convicted, and that his confession should not have been used against him. Lorne was eventually transferred to McDougall Walker Correctional Facility in Suffield, Connecticut, where he spent 38 years behind bars. During this time, he accumulated 8 disciplinary offenses, including assault, possession of drugs, contraband, and other violations. His last infraction occurred in 1997, when he was charged with assault and refusing to provide a specimen. Then, in June of 2015, Lorne's health took a drastic turn. He was placed on a ventilator in the intensive care unit after suffering a medical crisis. As the Department of Correction indicated, Lorne had no family willing or able to make medical decisions for him. The judge was called to make a decision regarding his care, but before the meeting could take place, Lorne passed away from a severe brain bleed. He was 65 years old at the time of his death, having entered prison at the age of 27. His death remained shrouded in mystery, as no autopsy was performed, and the cause of the brain bleed was never determined. Following his death, Robert DeClark, the former owner of the funeral home, sought and received custody of Lorne's remains. After performing a cremation, Lorne's ashes were stored, and DeClark periodically brought them to the Department of Correction in the hopes of finding any relatives who might come forward. But no one did, and to be honest, it feels like Lorne got exactly what he deserved, alone and forgotten. No child, not even Cheryl, deserves a death like that. The violence, the cruelty, it's almost impossible to wrap your mind around. The lingering heartbreak must have been unbearable for the remaining family, especially Fred, the father. Case 6. This is the story of Buck Ruxton, the smart boy who would change the course of criminal investigation with a crime so heinous that it exposed the depths of human brutality. But before he became a cold-blooded murderer, Buck Ruxton was an ordinary son to a respectable family. Buck Ruxton was born in Bombay, British India, now called Mumbai, on March 21, 1899, into a wealthy middle-class family. His upbringing was respectable, and though he was a sensitive boy with few friends, he was highly intelligent. Early on, he set his sights on becoming a doctor. With his parents' financial support, he studied at the University of Bombay, earning his Bachelor of Medicine in 1922 and his Bachelor of Surgery in 1923. Shortly after, he secured a position at a Bombay hospital, specializing in medicine, midwifery, and gynecology. His ambitions did not stop there. On October 29, 1923, Ruxton was commissioned into the Indian Medical Service as a medical officer. He was sent to Basra, the city of great strategic importance under British control, where soldiers and civilians alike suffered from war wounds, infections, and the scorching heat of West Asia. The medical stations in Basra were overcrowded, and young doctors like Ruxton were expected to burn the midnight oil, treating cases of battle injuries, disease, and malnutrition. It was intense labor that he endured, making him a strong practitioner, but a human being lacking in empathy each passing day. Later, Ruxton was stationed in Baghdad, where he witnessed the brutal aftermath of war firsthand. Battlefield medicine was gruesome, and doctors were often forced to make split-second decisions that meant life or death. The constant exposure to suffering and death shaped him in ways that would become evident in the years to come. In October 1926, he gave up his commission, turning his back on military medicine and setting his sights on other opportunities. During this time, Ruxton entered into an arranged marriage with a Parsi woman named Madhabai Jahangiri Gadiali in May 1925. However, the marriage did not work out. With financial assistance from his family and the Bombay Medical Service, Ruxton relocated to Britain in 1926. He attended medical courses at London's University College Hospital under the name Gabriel Hakim, before moving to Edinburgh in 1927 to begin studies towards obtaining a fellowship of the Royal Colleges of Surgeons. Although he failed his entrance examination, the General Medical Council authorized him to practice medicine in the United Kingdom based on his Bombay qualifications. Shortly thereafter, he legally changed his name via deed poll to Buck Ruxton. While studying in Edinburgh, Ruxton met a 26-year-old woman named Isabella Vanis, who managed a cafe in the city. Isabella had been briefly married to a Dutchman in 1919, but the marriage had lasted for only weeks, and she had resumed using her maiden name, Kerr. The two slowly began liking each other, and were soon a couple. Isabella accompanied Ruxton when he relocated to England in 1928. There he worked as a locum for a London doctor, Manik Madafram, a fellow Parsi, before becoming an assistant to a Stepney-based doctor, B.R. Reigate. While the relocation was happening, Isabella was already pregnant with Ruxton's child. In 1929, Isabella gave birth to the couple's first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth. The family seemed stable, but behind the facade, Ruxton's aggressive nature and controlling behavior were becoming more evident. His jealousy and paranoia were slowly growing, and it was not long before he unleashed the monster within. Now the fits of anger and bouts of hysteria became routine in this house, where a home that Isabella made with love had turned into a hellhole for her. Their fights were so intense that police were called to their house multiple times, only for Isabella to return to him, after his desperate pleas and apologies. Isabella tried to escape. On several occasions, she packed her things and left for Edinburgh with her children. But Ruxton always managed to pull her back in, begging her to return, swearing his love, promising change while bending on his knees, his head down and tears rolling down his eyes. But nothing changed. In 1932, Isabella attempted to unalive herself. The method she used was gruesome. Gas asphyxiation was nearly fatal. She lost a pregnancy in the process. But even this did not end their relationship. She stayed, trapped in a cycle of violence and manipulation by a man who knew a way with his words. The police were familiar with the Ruxton household, having been called multiple times to settle their heated arguments. During one visit, Ruxton told an officer, "Sergeant, I feel like murdering two persons. My wife is going out to meet a man." In early September 1935, Isabella traveled to Edinburgh to visit her sister. She was accompanied by a prominent Lancaster family, the Edmondsons, who were close to the Ruxtons. Buck Ruxton did not go, staying behind due to his busy schedule as a doctor. But in his mind, this trip confirmed his worst suspicions. He was certain that Isabella was having an affair. He was even sure of the man she was having an affair with, Robert Edmondson, a young assistant editor in the local town hall. His jealousy consumed him, and by the time Isabella returned, Ruxton had already decided her fate. On the night of September 14, 1935, Isabella left to visit her sisters in Blackpool and see the Blackpool illuminations. She returned home late, around midnight. That night, Ruxton's paranoia and rage had taken the best of him. Confronting Isabella with allegations of infidelity that night, Ruxton lost control of himself. The sick assumption of his wife being a cheater left him in a fit of rage. Not knowing how to handle the monster that Ruxton had become, Isabella panicked, trying to run away. But it was too late. Blinded by fury, Ruxton attacked his wife. Perhaps it began with his hands closing around her throat, cutting off her breath, squeezing until her struggles weakened and her body slumped. Did she lose consciousness? Or did she die in that cruel, suffocating embrace? We may never know. But strangulation was not enough. His rage demanded more. He beat her, fists colliding with her delicate bones, shattering the bone structure of her face. And then came the blade, a cold, fatal finality, driving into her flesh, spilling her life onto the floor. He strangled, beat, and stabbed Isabella to death. But someone else had seen too much. Remember the eyewitness? She was murdered by the monster for the intention of eliminating every trace of his crime. Mary Jane Rogerson, their housemaid. Perhaps she heard the struggle and rushed in. Perhaps she was already there, her presence an unfortunate twist of fate. Perhaps she screamed. Perhaps she tried to run. But Ruxton could not let her live. Did she plead? Did she beg for her life? It didn't matter. His frenzied wrath turned to her with equal savagery. Blows rained down, the housemaid's skull fracturing beneath his fists. Maybe she cried out once. Maybe she had time to realize the horror of her fate before his hands found her throat. A desperate struggle, a body thrashing, fingers clawing at his skin, weakly grasping at nothing. Her final breath choked into silence. And then the knife again. Did he stab her to ensure she was dead? Or had he simply lost all control, his insatiable violence continuing long after her life had drained away? When it was over, when both women lay lifeless, their blood staining the floor, Ruxton stood amidst the carnage he had created. But his madness was not yet complete. Ruxton quickly set to work covering his tracks. Before the murders, he had told both of his charwomen not to come to the house until Monday, already ensuring no one would enter the home too soon and see the monstrosity he had committed that night. He had already killed Isabella and Mary Jane, but their suffering had not yet ended. The family, who once saw the intelligent boy making his mark in the most respectable field in India, would later be informed about the heinous ways their son used his knowledge. Ruxton used his medical expertise to dismember the bodies. Blood pooled in the house, staining the stairs and walls. He removed the carpet and burned towels in the garden to destroy evidence. The next day, he dropped his children off at a friend's home before returning to clean the crime scene. Later, he asked a patient and her husband to help him prepare for decorators, an excuse to explain the missing carpets and the mess in his home. When Mrs. Hampshire arrived at Dalton Square, she saw something was terribly wrong. Blood-stained carpet, a locked room with straw protruding from beneath the door, and a suit, Ruxton's suit, soaked in blood. He gave them stained stair carpeting and his suit, asking them to clean it. He thought he had covered his tracks, until a complete stranger discovers the horrors of his unfathomable crime. The morning of September 29, 1935 began like any other for Susan Haynes Johnson, a young woman walking near an old stone bridge nestled in the remote countryside, 2 miles or 3 kilometers north of Moffat, a quiet market town in Dumfriesshire, Scotland. The landscape was serene, the garden home Lynn stream flowing with grace beneath the bridge, its waters heavy from recent rains. Mist lingered over the hills, and the air was damp with the scent of earth and foliage. As she leaned over the parapet of the bridge to admire the view, soaking the misty air in, something caught her eye, a large misshapen bundle crammed against a boulder in the rushing water below. At first she thought it might be an abandoned sack of clothing or discarded rubbish that swept down the stream, but something about the way it was caught on the rocks made her stomach churn. It did not feel right, and every fiber in her body was telling her to run away. But ignoring the cues of her body, Susan walked closer to the sack. The fabric, darkened by water, clung tightly to its contents, revealing unsettling contours of a human body. Then a grotesque detail sent a jolt of horror through her body. A human arm, bloated and partially decomposed, protruded from the fabric, fingers curling unnaturally, as if reaching for something that Susan could not see. Susan gasped, stumbling back from the parapet, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could not tear her gaze away from the limp, lifeless limb, the exposed flesh gray and rotting, slashed with nauseating precision. A chill crawled up her spine. Someone had mutilated this body in the most disrespectful way possible. Her scream teared through the morning stillness. What started as a pleasant morning turned into an unforgettable one, a day that will haunt Susan forever in her dreams. The gruesome discoveries at Garden Home Lynn sent shockwaves through Scotland. The Dumfriesshire Constabulary, faced with a crime of unprecedented brutality, knew they needed specialized expertise. Detective officers from Glasgow were immediately summoned, and by the following day Detective Lieutenant William Ewing and Detective Lieutenant Bertie Hammond arrived in Moffat. What they found was nothing short of a nightmare. The bodies were mangled, severed, and stripped of nearly every identifying feature, which presented an immediate challenge. Even determining their sex was difficult due to the extensive disfigurement. The killer had left nothing to chance, making sure that traditional methods of identification, such as dental records or fingerprints, were either impossible or severely compromised. But killers always make mistakes. While reviewing the case in Dumfries, Detective Ewing happened upon a newspaper report detailing the recent disappearance of 2 women from Lancaster, England. Something about the description stopped him cold. One of the missing women bore a remarkable similarity, at least in height and build, to one of the butchered victims found in the Annan River. Ewing's instincts told him there was a connection, so he decided to follow his instincts, and soon the evidence began mounting. Amid the bloody ruins of the corpses, a single piece of newspaper would prove to be one of the most disturbing clues. The victims had been wrapped in editions of the Sunday Graphic, a national publication. On the surface, this meant little until detectives discovered something crucial. This specific edition of the Sunday Graphic had only been distributed in the Lancaster district. The trail of horror was beginning to lead away from Moffat and into England. Another glaring detail sent chills down the spine of the investigators. The manner in which the bodies had been dismembered was unlike any ordinary murder. This was no haphazard act of rage. Instead, the precise incisions, the calculated removal of identifying features, and the total destruction of distinguishing marks all pointed to one irrefutable fact. The murderer had an expert knowledge of human anatomy. This was not the work of a mere criminal. This was the work of a highly skilled surgeon. As detectives dug deeper into the Lancaster disappearances, 2 names surfaced. Number 1 was Mrs. Isabella Ruxton, the wife of a prominent physician, Dr. Buck Ruxton, and the second was Mary Rogerson, Isabella's maid, who had vanished alongside her employer. The connection was too strong to ignore. Ruxton's wife and maid had disappeared, and 2 mutilated bodies had been found hundreds of miles away. Detectives turned their attention toward Dr. Buck Ruxton, a man known famously for his precision. Rumors had already swirled about his volatile temper and his obsessive jealousy toward his wife. Now, with 2 unclaimed bodies and his wife missing, the police had good reason to suspect him. It was time to pay him a visit. Dr. Buck Ruxton was soon arrested, and with his detention, the police were given unrestricted access to his house in Dalton Square, Lancaster. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. The bathroom, once a place of cleanliness and somewhat luxury, bore the unmistakable scars of murder. Blood stains, some still visible, others desperately scrubbed away, covered the stair carpet and the floors. The scene reeked of a failed cover-up, the murderer's attempt to wash away his sins proving futile under the scrutiny of forensic science. But a body is more than just flesh and blood. It touches things. It leaves marks. And it was fingerprints that would finally seal Ruxton's fate. The forensic team knew that if they could match a fingerprint from the bodies to any print inside the house, it would prove beyond doubt that at least one of the victims had once lived there. But there was a problem. Only 1 set of fingertips remained intact, those belonging to the maid, Mary Rogerson. The other set, belonging to Isabella Ruxton, had been severed and were never recovered. The killer had made sure that his wife's hands would never betray him, even if she had betrayed him in his sick mind. But he had underestimated the tenacity of science. Detective Bertie Hammond and Detective Sergeant Duncan meticulously combed through the house, examining every possible surface. From the lampshades in the attic to the medicine bottles in the basement, nothing was left untouched. Every cup, saucer, bottle, and dish was dusted, and hundreds of fingerprints emerged. Then in the bathroom, they found the one that mattered most, a clear palm print on the door. This print would later be forensically matched to the dead hands of Mary Rogerson. She had been here. She had died here. And so had Isabella Ruxton. The final nail in Buck Ruxton's coffin came from Professor John Glaister, the forensic scientist leading the post-mortem examination. With Ruxton's wife horrifically disfigured, traditional identification was nearly impossible. But Glaister had another trick up his sleeve. Using X-ray imaging, he superimposed radiographs of Isabella Ruxton's skull over old photographs of her taken when she was alive and well. The shape of the skull, the jawline, and the bone structure all aligned perfectly. There was no longer any doubt. The butchered remains pulled from the river were those of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson, and their murderer was Dr. Buck Ruxton. The case of Dr. Ruxton would go on to become one of the most groundbreaking murder investigations in British history. It was a case of science versus savagery, where forensic innovation won over the butchery of a distasteful man. Dr. Buck Ruxton had believed himself untouchable, a man so meticulous in dismembering his victims that he thought no one could ever piece them back together. But he was wrong. The river had not carried away his sins. The newspapers had not hidden his crime, and the fingerprints of the dead had spoken louder than any defense he could muster. A doctor who once saved lives was now condemned to die. On March 2nd, 1936, the trial of Dr. Buck Ruxton commenced at Manchester's High Court of Justice. He was charged with the murders of his wife, Isabella Ruxton, and their housemaid, Mary Jane Rogerson. The case had drawn widespread attention due to the gruesome nature of the crimes and the forensic techniques used to identify the victims. Ruxton pleaded not guilty, but the prosecution built a strong case against him, supported by forensic evidence and witness testimonies. The prosecution, led by Joseph Cooksey Jackson, KC, argued that Ruxton's motive was rooted in jealousy. Following the murders, Ruxton attempted to conceal his crimes by meticulously dismembering the bodies. The remains were then transported over 100 miles from Lancaster to Scotland, where they were disposed of in a remote ravine near the River Lynn. He took extensive measures to prevent identification, including mutilating facial features and removing fingertips. Ruxton's defense, led by Norman Burkett, KC, attempted to cast doubt on the identification of the bodies and suggested alternative explanations for the presence of bloodstains in his home. The defense argued that the forensic evidence was circumstantial and did not definitively link Ruxton to the crime. However, forensic experts had successfully linked the fabric used to wrap the bodies to materials found in Ruxton's home, and the blood patterns matched those of the victims. Additionally, Ruxton's erratic behavior following the discovery of the remains, including providing conflicting accounts of his wife's whereabouts, further undermined his defense. After a trial that lasted 11 days, the jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning a guilty verdict. Dr. Buck Ruxton was found guilty of double murder, and on May 12, 1936, he was set to be hanged at HM Prison, Manchester. A final twist emerged after Ruxton's execution, when a sealed letter he had written shortly after his arrest was made public. The letter wrote, "I killed Mrs. Ruxton in a fit of temper because I thought she had been with a man. I was mad at the time. Mary Jane Rogerson was present at the time. I had to kill her." This confession removed any lingering doubts about his sentence. It was confirmed that he had, indeed, not only murdered those people but had their bodies dismembered. Case 7. 4 innocent young women were completely burned to death in a small yogurt shop. But the most horrifying part is that before being burned alive, they were raped and killed by fatal gunshots to the head. The police launched a large-scale investigation, interrogating a total of 342 suspects. But after many years, the killer remains an elusive, mysterious figure who cannot be found. On the night of December 6th, investigator John Jones of the Austin Police Department in Texas received an emergency call from the dispatch center. Initially, the call was simply reporting a fire at a yogurt shop, but shortly after, the information was updated to reveal that this was no ordinary fire. It had turned into a robbery and brutal murder, with 4 victims dead. When Jones arrived at the scene, the sight before him was completely different from any previous fires he had dealt with. The yogurt shop, which should have been a place filled with the laughter and chatter of customers, was now nothing but a desolate wreck filled with smoke and ashes. As he stepped inside, Jones' flashlight beam swept over the smoke-damaged walls and the dust-covered floor. amid the lingering haze of smoke and heat, for charred bodies lay scattered throughout the shop. What was most haunting was that they were all young girls, under 18 years old. Their bodies were burned to the point of near total unrecognizability, with skin shriveled from the intense heat and some body parts horribly distorted. Detective Jones believed that fire was not the primary cause of their deaths, but rather, it seemed someone had set the fire to erase the evidence. He also concluded that someone had intentionally set the bodies on fire to hide an even more horrific crime behind it. The 4 bodies found in the ruins of the yogurt shop were quickly identified. 2 of them were employees working at the shop that night, Eliza Thomas and Jennifer Harbison. The other 2 victims were Sarah Harbison, Jennifer's sister, and Amy Ayers, a close friend who had stopped by the shop to wait for them to finish their shift before heading home together. However, the remaining traces at the scene showed that the 4 girls had endured extreme terror before being murdered. They had their mouths gagged and were tightly bound with their own clothing, a sign that the killer not only wanted to kill them, but also wanted to strip away any chance of escape or resistance. But that wasn't the most horrifying part. After killing the victims, the murderer didn't leave immediately. He even set fire to burn the entire crime scene. The flames erupted fiercely, burning everything in the confined space of the shop. Not only were the bodies severely damaged, but all the crucial evidence was almost entirely destroyed. When firefighters gained control of the blaze, the black smoke had covered every surface, making fingerprint collection nearly impossible. The killer not only acted ruthlessly, but it seemed he also knew how to meticulously erase the evidence. When the police conducted the autopsies, the investigators found that all the victims had been shot in the head. During the examination of the gunshot wounds, they discovered that 2 different types of bullets had been used. The presence of 2 firearms with calibers 380 and .22 at the same crime scene was not a coincidence. This was clear evidence that at least 2 murderers were involved in this horrific crime. Although all the bullets from the scene were recovered, the real headache for the police was that both of the guns used in the crime had vanished without a trace. After confirming this information, the police immediately released the news nationwide, hoping that someone would provide clues about the guns or suspects involved. All possibilities were considered, and as the investigation expanded, the number of potential suspects grew to 342 people. Among those being investigated, one name stood out and attracted special attention from the investigators, Maurice Pierce. Just 8 days after the massacre, this teenager was arrested at a shopping mall not far from the yogurt shop. What made him the prime suspect was the gun he was carrying, which matched one of the weapons used in the murders. The police quickly had Morris's gun examined, hoping it would be the key to solving the case. Fearing he might be charged, Maurice Pierce named 3 other individuals, Forrest Wellborn, Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen. He claimed that these 3 friends were the ones who directly committed the crime, and he was merely the driver who helped the group escape after the crime was completed. According to Morris's testimony, the .22 caliber gun found on him was not the murder weapon. He had given another pistol to Forrest to carry out the killings. This created a completely new line of investigation, and the police quickly planned to verify this claim. They decided to stage a call between Maurice and Forrest, where Maurice would hint at the case, and the police would listen in on the conversation to observe Forrest's reaction. If both were truly involved, a careless comment could reveal the secret they were trying to hide, but what happened was completely unexpected when Forrest had no idea what Maurice was talking about. His response was full of confusion, as if it was the first time he had ever heard of the case. Not only that, but when summoned for questioning, Morris's 3 friends adamantly denied any involvement in the murder. They offered no confessions, nor was there any sign of fear or inconsistent statements. Although the police suspected something was being hidden, they couldn't find any physical evidence to charge them. Therefore, the investigation team was forced to release Morris's 3 friends. Furthermore, Maurice was also released because the investigation confirmed that the gun on him was not the weapon used in the crime. The investigation team then began focusing on a group of local residents who showed suspicious signs. During their search for clues, a particular name kept appearing, leading the police to believe that this man was connected to the case. The task force decided to raid his house, hoping to find important evidence, but after a thorough search, all they found were rat bones and some strange items, with no trace of the case. 2 months after the horrific murder, the police shifted their focus to another suspect. Several witnesses reported that on that evening, A mysterious man had been sitting in a car outside the yogurt shop, observing everything around him with a suspicious attitude. This man never entered the shop, nor did he seem in a hurry to leave. He just sat silently in the car, as if waiting for something. The police quickly created a sketch of the man based on descriptions, and widely released it in the media. However, things grew even more mysterious when another group of investigators from the sexual crime unit discovered a suspicious coincidence. 3 weeks earlier, a kidnapping and sexual assault had occurred in the city of Austin, and the police were looking for the man involved in that crime. Therefore, they had a sketch that looked almost identical to the suspect in the yogurt shop murder case. Everything started to come together, leading the police to consider the possibility that the two cases might be connected. If the kidnapper and the murderer were the same person, then this case might not be just a calculated murder, but a premeditated series of crimes. Although the exact identity had not been confirmed, these clues opened up a completely new direction for the investigation. In the fall of the year 1992, after months of searching, the suspect in the kidnapping case was arrested in Mexico. This man looked very similar to the suspect in the sketch, which made the Austin police believe they were very close to the truth. When questioned by Austin investigators, he only confessed to kidnapping and sexually assaulting a woman, but firmly denied any involvement in the yogurt shop murder. He claimed to know nothing about the case and dismissed all accusations. But when interrogated by Mexican authorities, everything changed. It's unclear what caused the change, but he confessed to being involved in the massacre. The Mexican government immediately announced that they would prosecute the two suspects in Mexico instead of extraditing them to the U.S. However, a serious issue quickly arose when the type of gun he confessed to using did not match the weapon used in the crime. These contradictions piled up, leading Detective John Jones's investigation team to not trust this confession. When questioned again, he suddenly retracted his entire statement and declared that he was never actually at the scene that night. This event marked a major setback in the investigation. Over the following years, the police continued to receive 6 other confessions, but all of them either lacked credible evidence or contained numerous inconsistencies. 1907 to 1994, nearly 3 years after the massacre occurred, John Jones, who had led the investigation from the beginning, was unexpectedly transferred out of the homicide unit. The Austin police believed that changing the investigation team could offer a fresh perspective and help uncover overlooked clues. Everything seemed to be at a standstill until October of 1999, when the Austin police unexpectedly reopened the investigation. After nearly 8 years without significant progress, they announced that they had arrested 4 men directly involved in the yogurt shop murders in the year 1991. On that day, the entire city of Austin held its breath as the authorities held an important press conference shortly afterward. The mayor of Austin stepped up and announced that the 4 arrested individuals were no strangers. They were Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen. These young men had been interrogated by the police just 8 days after the murder, but they were released due to lack of evidence. Although there was no physical evidence to charge the 4 suspects, the police had 2 confessions from Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen. The first confession came from Michael Scott after a 20-hour interrogation spread over 4 consecutive days. Under the immense pressure from the investigators, he lowered his head onto the starting to admit what had happened at the yogurt shop on that fateful night. According to Michael's testimony, the massacre was not planned from the beginning. He and the others had intended to carry out a simple robbery, and the yogurt shop had become the target from the beginning of the day. But when night fell, everything turned into something much more than a regular robbery. None of them knew exactly what triggered the killing spree, but Michael would never forget the horrifying sound that echoed throughout the small room. He described the gunshots as relentless, repeating over and over like an endless nightmare that still haunted him to this day. Hours later, Robert Springsteen was also brought into the interrogation room. He confirmed most of what Michael had previously testified to, but what sent chills down the investigators' spines was the detail Robert added. He confessed to having shot one of the girls, but the worst part was that he had sexually assaulted the victim before killing her. Despite the confessions, the police still lacked DNA evidence, witnesses, and the murder weapon, leaving the case full of gaps. Even after being charged, Robert's lawyer publicly stated that his client had been coerced throughout the prolonged interrogation. According to Robert's testimony, the police had exhausted his will and forced him to confess simply to escape the interrogation room. Many years later, in the year 2009, Robert first spoke to the media, claiming his complete innocence. Robert shared that the police wouldn't let him leave until they had heard what they wanted. Meanwhile, Michael Scott's lawyer also accused that his client was mentally terrorized throughout the interrogation process. Both were pushed to their psychological limits, and when the police obtained the confessions they wanted, it seemed everything had been decided. Not only Michael and Robert, but the police still believed that Maurice Pierce was the one sent to the scene that night to stand watch, assisting the others in carrying out the crime. For many years, Maurice was repeatedly called in for questioning, under pressure from both the investigating agency and the public. However, he steadfastly claimed that he was not involved in the murder. With too many contradictions in the testimonies, the case gradually reached an impasse. After months of investigation, the grand jury could not make a decision to indict Forrest, leading to all charges against him being dismissed. Maurice Pierce was also released, as the prosecution couldn't find any strong evidence to charge him. But for Michael and Robert, things were not as simple. Even though their confessions were retracted, their initial statements were enough to bring them to trial. In the year 2001, both Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were brought to trial. When the trial officially began, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were tried separately. Although both had confessed to participating in the crime, neither of them testified against the other. The prosecutors had no direct witnesses, no physical evidence, and no murder weapon. However, they had both of their confessions, and that became the most crucial piece of evidence to convict them. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with arguments presented to prove that the two defendants had planned the attack on the yogurt shop, raped one of the victims, and killed all 4 girls. As the time to decide drew near, the jury deliberated for 13 hours before returning the verdict that Robert Springsteen was sentenced to death. In the year 2002, Michael Scott was also sentenced to life in prison, but the case did not end there. For many years afterward, the U.S. judicial system faced intense scrutiny as a series of questions regarding the trial process began to surface. Many lawyers and legal activists believed that Robert and Michael's constitutional rights had been violated during the trial. In the year 2006, the case took a significant turn when the Texas Supreme Court decided to review the entire case file. 15 years after that fateful night, the convictions of both Robert and Michael were officially overturned. In an effort to strengthen the case, the prosecution requested DNA testing on samples collected from the body of one of the victims who had been sexually assaulted on the night of the crime. They believed this DNA could be crucial evidence in confirming whether Robert or Michael had actually committed the crime. However, the DNA did not match any of the 4 original suspects, including Robert, Michael, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. This was particularly strange because, in his initial confession, Robert had stated that he was the one who raped one of the victims. This DNA evidence not only completely undermined Robert's confession, but also opened up a more terrifying hypothesis that a different person, never arrested, might be the actual killer. In the year 2009, all charges against Robert and Michael were officially dropped. After nearly 10 years of imprisonment, both were released, but the legal doors had not truly closed, as they were not fully exonerated. Under the law, the case could still be reopened in the future if new evidence emerged, meaning the shadow of the case still loomed over their fate. In the year 2017, 25 years after the horrifying night, the Austin Police Department decided to use the most advanced DNA technology to compare samples obtained from the crime scene with publicly available online DNA databases. But despite the significant advancements in forensic science, the samples in the database were still incomplete, making it difficult to find a matching result. While there has been no final resolution, DNA testing technology continues to progress rapidly, offering hope that one day, the DNA sample collected over 30 years ago may provide the answers everyone has been searching for. The yogurt shop murder case not only left a haunting legacy for the people of Austin, but also led to a major change in the USA legal system. On August 3rd, in the year 2022, the Victims' Rights Act was officially signed into law. This law, which was formed due to the shortcomings in the yogurt shop case, allows families of victims in cold cases to request federal investigators to review the case using the most advanced technologies. This means that, although the case has spanned over 3 decades, it is far from closed. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story, and we'll see you in the next video. Case 8. Clara Suarez was born and raised in Colombia, where she grew up with ambition and a strong work ethic. Determined to build a successful future, she pursued a career in dentistry and eventually immigrated to the United States. She moved to Texas, where she established herself as a well-respected dentist, admired for her dedication and professionalism. There, she met David Harris, a successful, charismatic, and easygoing orthodontist known for his friendly demeanor. The two quickly built a life together. They married on February 14, 1992 at the Nassau Bay Hilton, a moment that seemed to mark the beginning of a perfect future together. Together, the couple ran a thriving dental practice in Friendswood, Texas, operating multiple offices with plans to expand even further. At home, they raised their twin sons, Brian and Bradley, born in 1998, along with David's 16-year-old daughter, Lindsay, from his previous marriage. To outsiders, David and Clara had a picture-perfect life, a beautiful home, a loving family, and successful careers, earning them about $650,000 per year, the equivalent to about $1.2 million when adjusted for 2025. Everything was going well until it wasn't. David started getting fit, losing weight, and spending unnecessary time at the office. He was having an affair, and it wasn't just a fling. He was seriously involved with a receptionist at the couple's practice named Gail Bridges, and the pair were not exactly subtle about it. From Gail bending over to pick something up, giving David a little rear-view show in the process, to her being inappropriately invited to management meetings, to her claiming the front seat in David's Suburban during group lunch outings, the staff found it awkward and disrespectful, especially since many were loyal to Clara. One of the staff members finally approached Clara on July 16, 2002, alerting her of the affair. Clara was devastated. She went out and got a makeover in an attempt to be more attractive to David. Then she confronted him. David acknowledged that he was having an affair. Clara told him that he had embarrassed her with their staff and said she wanted them to start marriage counseling. David apologized and assured her that he would end it. Clara then promptly fired Gail and began a campaign to win back her husband's affection. She joined a gym, hired a personal trainer, bought sexy lingerie from Victoria's Secret, and consulted with and made a deposit to a plastic surgeon regarding liposuction and breast enhancements. She also planned to change her demeanor to agree with everything David said, a trait that David told Clara that he found attractive about Gail. Shortly afterward, David asked Clara if he could take Gail to dinner to get closure. The plan was that he would meet Gail on July 24, 2002, and end it for good. But Clara wasn't convinced. Suspicious, she hired a private investigator to follow David that night. It was reported that she had also retained the private investigator because she heard rumors that Gail was seeing another woman. So the private investigator would come in handy for investigating that as well, with Clara hoping that if she could show David evidence that Gail was involved with a woman, he would no longer be interested in her. The private investigator followed David to his closure meeting with Gail, then notified Clara that David had indeed met up with Gail, but not at a restaurant like he had promised. Instead, they had gone to the Hilton Hotel, the very place where Clara and David had celebrated their wedding reception, and they were still there. So Clara got in the car, bringing her 16-year-old stepdaughter along with her. When they arrived at the hotel, they immediately spotted Gail's SUV, recognizable from her time working at their dental practice. Clara wasted no time. She got out and vandalized Gail's car, severely keying the sides and ripping off or bending the windshield wipers. Clara and Lindsay then went inside to the hotel lobby, but David and Gail were nowhere to be found. When they asked the front desk, they were told that no one by those names was checked in. Determined to flush him out, Clara called David's cell phone, telling him that one of their twin boys was sick and that he needed to come home. It worked. Moments later, David emerged with Gail, the two of them holding hands. Furious, Clara lunged at the couple. David was able to defend himself, but Gail was not. Clara grabbed her by the hair and slammed her head onto the marble floor, ripping her blouse in the process. Several men tried pulling Clara off, but she was in a rage. She was able to slam Gail's head to the floor again before finally being removed. Hotel staff broke up the fight and forced Clara and Lindsay to leave. The staff escorted them to Carla's Mercedes, while David and Gail headed to Gail's now vandalized SUV. But Clara wasn't done. Behind the wheel of her Mercedes-Benz, she was fuming. She began circling the parking lot. As David walked toward his vehicle with Gail, Clara hit the gas, accelerating toward the couple. With the Mercedes hurtling toward them, Gail was pushed into the SUV just before the Mercedes rammed into David with full force. The impact launched him 25 feet across the parking lot. At that point, the private investigator that Clara had hired to follow David began video recording, and Carla was still not done. She circled around and hit David a second time, this time running him over. Then she circled again and ran over her husband a third time. But Carla was still not done. After having run over her husband 3 times, she backed the car up and ran over him backward a 4th time. After that, some witnesses claim she proceeded forward again and ran over him a 5th time, while others claim that when she reversed over him, she stopped, leaving the car resting on top of him. Then she jumped out, leaned over his body, and began sobbing over him and stating, "David, look what you made me do." Throughout the horrifying ordeal, David's 16-year-old daughter Lindsay was in the front passenger seat, witnessing everything unfold and pleading with her stepmother to stop. Nearby witnesses were also helplessly screaming. David Harris died at the scene, and Carla was arrested. The wealthy dentist was out on bail within a day. Her legal team wasted no time preparing her defense, while prosecutors built their case around the brutal footage along with eyewitness testimony. The case immediately grabbed national attention. A respected dentist, a public affair, and a murder caught on tape. It had all the makings of a courtroom spectacle. When the trial began, the question was not whether Clara had killed David. That was undisputed. It was instead whether the jury would see it as murder, or even premeditated murder, since she knew of the affair well beforehand. It would take over a year for Clara to stand trial as legal teams gathered evidence, reviewed the shocking footage, and debated whether her actions were fueled by premeditation or uncontrollable emotion. During that time, opinion about the case was divided. Some sympathized with the sheer anger that comes with betrayal, even considering Clara a hero. Others believed her actions were clear, calculated revenge. At trial, Clara's legal team faced an uphill battle. Already a challenge to defend someone accused of steamrolling their spouse 1 time, they faced defending someone who circled and repeated the act 5 times. Clara claimed it was all a terrible accident. She testified that when David and Gail walked out of the hotel, she got back in her car with her stepdaughter and drove around the building, intending to crash into Gail's SUV. Not David, but as she circled back, she said she unexpectedly saw David walking, and that by the time she noticed him, it was too late to stop. She insisted she never meant to hit him. She denied running over David more than once, but the prosecution noted that each time she circled, the car visibly lifted, as if rolling over something solid. Clara insisted that the bumps seen in the video were from her car going over a curb, not his body. And the video wasn't the only recorded evidence. 2 days after the killing, and 1 day after she posted bond, Clara had a phone call with a private investigator she had hired to follow David. In the recorded conversation, she was more concerned about what had been captured than with what happened. Although Clara had hired the private investigator to get video proof of her husband's affair, she seemed unaware that her own actions had also been caught on tape. She was now rightfully concerned that every moment, along with its consequences, had been preserved in such detail. So she pressed to find out exactly how much had been captured. Clara remains calm throughout the conversation, but never once claims that it was an accident. Clara also had one final piece of business to settle with the private investigator. With her husband dead, the job had ended early, so she figured that should come with a refund. This audio conversation never made it into court, but it highlighted Clara's state of mind in the aftermath of the incident. Clara's stepdaughter Lindsay, who was in the front passenger seat, directly contradicted Clara's story. She testified that before hitting David, Clara said out loud, "I'm going to hit him." Lindsay recalled screaming, "Stop, you're killing him," as her father tried to escape. She said David tried evading the vehicle and also pleaded with Clara to stop, but she said Clara was very determined. Her testimony was emotional and devastating, and Clara sobbed into her hands as she listened. Multiple eyewitnesses backed up Lindsay's account, confirming that Clara ran over David multiple times. The hotel manager testified that it was 3 times. The front desk manager said that she ran over him 3 times, then backed over him a 4th time. The night manager saw her do it twice, and 3 tennis players who witnessed the incident each testified that it was multiple times. But the medical examiner's report was less clear. While witnesses testified that Clara ran over David multiple times, the examiner only found 1 definitive tire mark on his body. The defense used that to argue that she only hit him once. They also claimed that her Mercedes did not have the radius needed to hit him more than once. The defense even hired a private consultant to recreate the scene and prove Clara only ran over David once. The prosecution countered by bringing in a police officer who pointed to a photo with a second tire track that led directly to David's body. When confronted with that overlooked tire track, the consultant could no longer support the defense's argument and the recreation was ruled inadmissible. In a final attempt to defend herself, Clara decided to take the stand and testify against the advice of her attorneys. That decision backfired. Since Clara took the stand, her original police interview, which had previously been ruled inadmissible, was now allowed in court, and only part of that interview was played. The jury was able to hear Clara say, "I wanted to hurt him," but they did not hear the part where she later said, "I didn't want to kill him." The pressure in the courtroom was intense. At one point, Clara's attorney collapsed from the stress. The judge called a recess, and he was taken to the hospital before later being released. But in the end, the prosecution had the most important evidence in the case, the video. They argued that it showed that this was not a crime of passion, but a deliberate act of murder. In February 2003, Clara Harris was found guilty for murdering her husband, David Harris. The jury determined that she acted under sudden passion, a legal distinction in Texas that reduces the sentencing range for murder. Normally, a murder conviction carries a sentence of 5 to 99 years or life. But a sudden passion ruling lowers it to 2 to 20 years. As a result, Harris received the maximum sentence allowed under the provision, 20 years in prison, along with a $10,000 fine. David's parents, Gerald and Mildred Harris, initially supported Clara, even requesting leniency during her trial and advocating for her probation. However, their relationship deteriorated after her conviction. One primary point of contention was the custody of Clara and David's twin sons. On the day of her sentencing, Clara informed her in-laws that she intended to grant custody of the boys to her neighbors instead of to them, which came as a surprise and disappointment to David's parents. Disputes also emerged over the distribution of David's estate. Clara received a substantial portion of the estate, estimated to be in excess of $1 million. David's parents believe it should have gone to their grandchildren. This led to David's parents filing a wrongful death lawsuit against Clara, citing loss of companionship, mental anguish, and financial support. In 2007, a jury awarded them $3.7 million in damages. In 2004, Clara sued her former attorney George Parnham, alleging that he overcharged her, mishandled her defense, and prioritized his own self-promotion over her case. She claimed that she paid him over $235,000, despite a verbal agreement of just $75,000. She also accused him of sharing her confidential financial info with other lawyers without her consent. In 2008, a jury ruled against Clara, and she was ordered to pay Parnham over $70,000 in unpaid expenses and nearly $400,000 in legal fees. Clara Harris was incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, where she worked on converting school textbooks to Braille for blind students. Her twin sons, who were 4 years old at the time of her imprisonment, and with whom she maintains a good relationship, were placed in the custody of David and Clara's close friends and neighbors, and they visited her about once a month. Clara was denied parole twice before it was eventually granted in November of 2017, when she was in her early 60s. She was released in May 2018 after serving 15 years of her 20-year sentence. In a 2023 interview, Carla, now virtually unrecognizable, expressed a strong desire to remain out of the public eye. While she spoke extensively with a reporter, she declined an on-camera interview, emphasizing that she wanted to live a quiet, normal life, free from the judgment and ridicule of her past. There is no report of her having made any apologies or acknowledgments during that interview or at any other time. In the end, Clara was not the first to be consumed by the rage of betrayal, nor will she be the last.